The moment nurse Sloane Merritt walked into the Kestrel Point K9 retirement auction, 30 military dogs stopped breathing. Not figuratively. Every animal in that room, trained to ignore explosions, to push through smoke and blood and chaos, went completely still the second she crossed the threshold. No whining, no shifting weight. 30 battle-hardened dogs locked onto one woman in hospital scrubs like she had just spoken the only word that mattered in every language they knew. Then she said the name. One name, barely above a whisper, and the entire building went so quiet that the auctioneer's gavel slipped from his fingers and clattered across the floor like a gunshot. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever believed that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous one, hit subscribe and come along for every part of this. Like the video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. Sloane Merritt drove 4 hours to get to Kestrel Point, and she did it in a car that needed an oil change and had a cracked rear windshield she'd been meaning to fix since October. She drove through the kind of flat, empty highway that sits between places people care about. The kind of road where you have too much time to think and not enough exits to escape what you're thinking about. She'd left Dunmore Regional Medical Center at 6 in the morning after a 12-hour overnight shift. She hadn't slept. She'd changed out of her scrubs into a clean pair in the hospital bathroom, splashed water on her face, drank the last inch of a gas station coffee that had been sitting on the counter since her midnight break, and got in her car. The envelope had arrived 3 days earlier, addressed to her home, no return address. Inside was a single photocopied document, an auction manifest for something called the Kestrel Point K9 Heritage Sale, a private event held at a converted livestock facility outside the city. The kind of place that didn't advertise publicly. The kind of sale that existed because someone had figured out how to monetize the gap between what the military discarded and what wealthy collectors were willing to pay for. Sloane almost threw the envelope away. She almost didn't open it at all because the week had been brutal, and she was the kind of tired that doesn't go away with one night of sleep. Then she saw the name in the manifest's second column, listed under lot number 14. Ranger. Male German Shepherd. Retired. Estimated age 9. Handler. Deceased. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after that. Ranger wasn't dead. She knew that. She knew it the same way she knew how to intubate a patient in the dark, how to hold pressure on a wound that was too far gone, how to keep her voice steady when everything around her was falling apart. Some things you know because you learned them, and some things you know because they were burned into you. Ranger was alive, which meant everything she'd been told 6 years ago was a lie. The Kestrel Point facility sat on 12 acres of dry grass and cracked asphalt outside the city limits. The main building had once been used for cattle shows, a large open structure with high ceilings, concrete floors, and the kind of acoustics that made every sound feel like it was happening twice. Someone had draped a vinyl banner across the entrance that read, Kestrel Heritage K9 Invitational Auction, Private Event, and 2 security guards in matching black polos stood at the front doors checking names against a clipboard. Sloane pulled into the gravel parking lot and sat in her car for a moment. She could see through the wide side windows that the building was already filling up. Men in sport coats, women with property auction energy, a few handlers in military-adjacent gear, the kind of tactical pants and fitted shirts that people wore when they wanted to look like they'd served without being required to prove it, and dogs. Rows of large wire kennels arranged along the far wall, each one holding an animal that Sloane's trained eye could immediately read as overtaxed. She got out of the car. She hadn't brought anything with her except her hospital ID, her phone, and the envelope. The security guard at the door barely glanced up. Name. Merritt. Sloane Merritt. He scrolled down the list. His expression didn't shift, but his posture tightened slightly. You're not on the registered buyer list, ma'am. I'm not here to buy. Then you're not cleared for entry. Sloane looked past him into the building. She could already see the kennels, could already count the dogs. 30, roughly. Separated by size and breed with a precision that had nothing to do with care and everything to do with catalog organization. I have a veterinary medical inquiry, she said. I'm a trauma nurse with K9 medical certification. I received documentation that one of the animals in this sale may have a falsified medical history. The guard looked at her more carefully now. She was maybe 5'5", wearing clean scrubs and shoes that had clearly logged too many hospital miles. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that hadn't been touched since before her overnight shift. She looked, by any reasonable measure, like someone who had come to the wrong place. "Ma'am, this is a private event. I'm aware of that. I'm going to need you to step back." She didn't move. She was very good at not moving when people expected her to. "Is there a medical director for the event? An official veterinarian of record? Step back, please." "I'll take that as a no." She stepped back because fighting the door guard wasn't the objective. She walked along the exterior wall until she found a side entrance that a man in a catering uniform was propping open with a plastic crate, and she walked through it without hesitating. But the inside of the building was louder than it looked from outside. The sound of 30 dogs in a confined space creates a specific frequency, not barking, exactly, more like the pressure of 30 living creatures, each carrying their own distress at a pitch just below human hearing. Sloane had worked around working dogs long enough that she felt it in her chest rather than heard it with her ears. She moved through the crowd slowly, keeping to the edges. The auction's registration tables were set up near the main entrance, and the kennels ran in 2 long rows down the center of the floor. Each kennel had a laminated card attached to the front: name, breed, age, estimated service years, handler status. That last one was listed as either active or retired deceased on every card she could see. She read the cards as she walked. Baron, male Belgian Malinois, age 8. Handler, retired, Surge, female Shepherd mix, age 7. Handler, retired, Ghost, male Husky blend, age 10. Handler, deceased. Kilo, male Dutch Shepherd, age 6. Handler, retired. Each card listed a microchip registration number. Sloane photographed them all as she moved, keeping her phone low and her posture casual, the same way she moved through chaotic emergency rooms when she needed to observe without triggering anyone. She was on the 14th kennel when a hand closed around her upper arm. "Excuse me." The voice belonged to a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that came from actual outdoor work and not a salon. He had silver hair swept back from a wide forehead and was wearing a sport coat over a collared shirt that cost more than Sloane's car payment. His smile was the kind designed to make you feel like you were already losing. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Victor Hale. This is my event." Sloane looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. "Sloane Merritt. Ms. Merritt." He didn't release her arm. "You weren't on our registration list. How exactly did you get inside?" "Side door." He blinked once. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. "Well." He released her arm and reset the smile. "I'm afraid this is an invitation-only event, and without a buyer registration, who certified the medical records for these animals?" The smile held. "I'm sorry?" "The laminated cards on the kennels list microchip numbers and handler statuses, but they don't list a certifying veterinarian. For an auction of this size, 30 animals with documented military service histories, USDA regulations require a licensed veterinarian to sign off on each animal's medical record before transfer of sale." She looked at him steadily. "Where's the vet of record?" Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear. He wasn't the kind of man who went to fear first. It was more like recalibration, the way a practiced liar recalibrates when someone asks the one question they hadn't scripted for. "Our veterinary documentation is complete and on file," he said. "If you have a concern, you're welcome to submit it in writing through the appropriate—" "Lot 14, Sloane said. "Where's Lot 14? Hale's jaw tightened. "I'm going to ask you to leave now." "I'd like to see Lot 14. "Security." He said it without raising his voice, which meant the security was close enough to hear a normal conversation. 2 men materialized at Sloane's flanks within 4 seconds. She noted their positions, noted the angle between them and the nearest kennel row, noted that the crowd around them had already started to pay attention. "Escorted out," Hale said pleasantly. "Carefully, please. We have guests." The guests were already watching. That was the problem for Hale. The same problem it always was for people who ran operations that depended on nobody looking too closely. Attention, once drawn, doesn't redirect easily. Sloane let the security men move her toward the side exit. She wasn't going to make a scene she wasn't ready to sustain. But as she passed the kennel rows, she was still reading cards, still photographing what she could, her phone angled down and the shutter silent. And then she saw it. Not lot 14. Not yet. But a name on a card 3 rows from the exit that wasn't on the manifest she'd been sent. Ranger. Lot 22. Male German Shepherd. Age 9. Handler, deceased. The manifest had listed him as Lot 14. Someone had moved him. Or the manifest had been wrong. Or someone had known she was coming and shuffled the cards. She stopped walking. The security guard on her left put a hand on her shoulder. "Keep moving, ma'am." "That dog," she said, not to him, to anyone listening. "That dog's name is wrong." "Ma'am, his name isn't Ranger." She said it loudly, clearly, the kind of voice she used when she needed a room of panicking people to listen. "His registered service name is a different name, and I can prove it." The guard tightened his grip. And that's when the dog in lot 22 stood up. What? He had been lying in the back corner of his kennel, the way old working dogs did when they were managing pain they'd been carrying long enough to make it invisible. Head down. Eyes half closed. The particular stillness of an animal that had learned somewhere along the way, that stillness was the safest response to an unpredictable environment. He was a German shepherd with a graying muzzle and a scar that ran diagonally across his left shoulder. Not a surgical scar, something older and rougher, the kind that field conditions left behind. His eyes were still sharp despite everything around them being worn down. He stood up when Sloane spoke. Not because she said Ranger, she hadn't called him by that name. She had said, in the middle of her sentence, in the cadence of her voice, a single syllable that wasn't the word anyone else in the room would have caught. But he caught it. He stood up and turned to face her, and went completely still. The security guard released her arm. It wasn't a decision, exactly. It was more that his body made the executive call before his brain could override it, because something about 30 dogs all shifting their attention to a single point at the same moment has an effect on human nervous systems that can't be entirely explained away. Every dog in the building had turned toward Sloane Merritt, not in aggression, not in alarm. In the same posture she recognized from years before, from a life she'd spent a long time convincing herself was behind her. It was an attention stance, the one that meant awaiting orders from a recognized authority. The auctioneer, who had been running a pre-sale introduction from a small raised platform at the far end of the room, stopped mid-sentence. Victor Hale stood very still. The crowd, which had been the normal background murmur of wealthy people entertaining themselves, went to absolute silence. Sloane looked at lot 22, looked at the dog with the scarred shoulder and the gray muzzle and the eyes that were still seeing everything clearly, despite belonging to an animal that someone had decided to throw away. She walked back toward his kennel. The security guards didn't stop her, possibly because they weren't sure what they were watching, and when you don't understand what's happening, the instinct is to wait. She crouched in front of the kennel, close, level with his eyes. She said one word, the real one. The one from 6 years ago, the one that wasn't in any manifest or laminated card or falsified medical record. The German shepherd pressed his nose against the chain link, and behind them, from somewhere beneath the concrete floor, came the muffled sound of a dog barking. The second bark was what broke the room open, because Sloane had heard it, had felt the vibration of it through the soles of her shoes, and she understood immediately what it meant. Not one dog was being hidden. Multiple animals were below them, in a space that shouldn't exist under a facility that was technically a converted livestock barn. She stood up. Victor Hale was already moving toward her, and this time his smile was completely gone. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Security, I want her removed now. I want her phone taken." "You can't take her phone." The voice came from somewhere in the crowd, and heads turned to find it. A man was pushing forward from the middle of the spectators. Late 30s, built like someone who had done real physical work for years and hadn't stopped, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of deliberate, measured movement that Sloane recognized as former military long before he said a single word. He was wearing civilian clothes, but carrying himself like someone who still woke up at 5 in the morning and ran regardless of weather. "That's evidence tampering. You touch her phone, you've got a federal problem." Hale turned to look at him. "And you are?" "Devlin Reyes." He held up a phone of his own. "Former Navy, SEAL Team 4. I've been recording for the last 7 minutes, and I've got about 11 other people in this room who can verify that this woman was removed for asking a legitimate regulatory question about veterinary documentation." He paused. "You want to keep going?" The room was rearranging itself. People who had come to this event expecting a quiet auction were now holding their phones up. Not all of them. Some had already moved toward the exit, the ones with reasons of their own to avoid documentation. But a substantial portion of the crowd had shifted from spectator to witness, and Victor Hale was standing in the middle of it, trying to find a version of this situation that still worked in his favor. There wasn't one. Not anymore. "There's an animal below this floor," Sloane said. She addressed the room, not Hale. "Possibly more than one. I can hear the bark. I need someone to help me find the access point." "There's no access point," Hale said. "This is a livestock facility. The floor is poured concrete over a pre-existing drainage system," Devlin said. "I checked the county building records when I registered for this event. This site was a working cattle operation until 2019. The drainage sublevel runs the entire length of the main building. There's an access hatch at the northeast corner." He looked at Sloane. "I didn't know what I was looking for when I pulled those records, but I pulled them." Sloane looked at him for a moment. He had the eyes of someone who had been to places that didn't make it onto official maps, and he had the steadiness of someone who had learned to read a situation without reacting to it until the moment reaction was necessary. "You knew something was wrong with this auction," she said. "My partner's dog is in here somewhere," he said. "My partner didn't make it back from a deployment in Artican province. They told me his canine was euthanized at the base facility 6 months after. But 3 weeks ago, someone sent me a manifest." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Different lot number, same dog." The two pieces of paper, unfolded side by side, had different lot numbers assigned to the same microchip registration code. Sloane looked at Victor Hale. Hale's expression had finally settled into something honest. Not remorse. Not fear in the way civilians thought of fear. It was the expression of a man calculating how much damage control was still possible and finding the math increasingly unfavorable. "Northeast corner," Sloane said to Devlin. "Northeast corner," he confirmed. They started walking. The access hatch was behind a rolling equipment shelf that had been positioned there deliberately, not to hide it from someone who was looking, but to hide it from someone doing a casual visual sweep. The kind of placement that said the person who put it there was experienced enough to know the difference. Sloane and Devlin moved the shelf together. It took about 15 seconds. The hatch was a standard drainage access panel, heavy steel, with a padlock that looked newer than everything else in the building. A veterinarian in the crowd, a woman who had introduced herself in the previous 10 minutes as Dr. Nadia Four, a licensed small animal vet who had come to the auction evaluating whether to purchase one of the retired animals for a service dog training program, produced a bolt cutter from her equipment bag without being asked. "I do farm calls," she said by way of explanation, and snipped the padlock. The hatch opened onto a concrete stairwell, and the smell that came up was wrong in a way that Sloane felt in her throat. Not the smell of death, nothing that severe, but the smell of animals in a space without adequate ventilation, with inadequate sanitation, for longer than anyone had disclosed. She went down first because she knew what she was looking for. The sublevel was larger than she'd expected. Rough concrete walls, fluorescent lighting on a single circuit that buzzed and flickered, and a row of wire kennels along the far wall that held 8 dogs. All of them were in worse condition than the animals upstairs. Some were sleeping in positions that suggested pain management. 2 were standing and tracking her movement with eyes that were still sharp enough to break her heart a little. She moved down the row, reading collars, reading scars, reading the physical language of each animal, with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from a decade of medical work and years before that of something else entirely. She was at the 4th kennel when she found the one she was looking for. Not Ranger, not Lot 22, or Lot 14, or any number on any manifest. The dog she had come for was smaller than he should have been, older, thinner, with a scar pattern on his right flank that she recognized not from a file, but from a specific afternoon 6 years ago when she had sutured that wound herself in a field condition that had not been ideal by any clinical measure. He looked at her the same way the dog upstairs had looked at her. She said his name, his real name. He made a sound that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a whine. The specific sound of an animal that had been waiting for something for a very long time and had started to lose the expectation of it arriving. She unlatched the kennel. He pressed against her legs hard enough that she had to brace herself, and she let him, both hands moving over him in the practiced way of someone doing an assessment, and the unpracticed way of someone who had missed something so badly it had left a mark that wasn't visible in any chart. "I've got you," she said quietly. "I've got you." Behind her, Devlin Reyes had found a kennel at the far end of the row. She could hear his voice, lower than usual, saying something she couldn't make out. And she could hear a dog responding in the particular register that meant recognition. Above them, through the concrete, the sound of voices was growing. Not the contained murmur of an auction crowd anymore. Something larger and less controlled. "Doctor." Four appeared at the bottom of the stairwell with her phone pressed to her ear. "I've called animal control," she said. "And I've also called a contact at the USDA regional office. They're flagging this as a potential military property matter, which means it's going to move faster than a standard animal welfare call." She paused. "I've also been photographing the kennel cards down here. The microchip numbers on 3 of these animals match registration codes from a DARPA-adjacent working dog program that was officially closed in 2020. Those dogs don't exist on paper anymore, but they're here." Sloane looked up at her. "Do you have the registration codes from the auction records upstairs?" "I photographed everything in the first 20 minutes, Four said. "I got here early. Something about this event didn't sit right with me when I registered. Can you cross-reference them?" "Already started." Four looked at the screen. "The dogs upstairs and down here, I'm finding overlapping microchip numbers. 2 different animals assigned the same registration code, which means someone was running 2 separate identity systems, one for the official records, one for whatever this is." Sloane knew exactly what this was. She had seen the architecture of this kind of deception before, not in the K-9 program specifically, but in the bureaucratic mechanisms that institutions use to make things disappear. Duplicate records, reassigned identifiers, death certificates filed for living beings. The paperwork infrastructure of erasure. Someone had built a system to strip these animals of their identities, their histories, their connections to the people who had worked alongside them, and then had sold them as if they were surplus equipment rather than veterans in their own right. The dog she was holding pressed his head against her collarbone. Upstairs, she heard Victor Hale's voice rising in volume, and then she heard a different kind of voice. The flat, carrying tone of someone accustomed to being heard in open spaces and outdoor environments, cutting through it. She didn't know whose voice it was yet, but it had the cadence of authority that didn't come from money or title. It came from a different kind of experience entirely. She looked at Devlin across the sublevel. He had straightened up from the kennel he'd been crouching in front of, and his expression had shifted. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that she recognized as the particular relief of a person who has been holding a weight for a long time and has just been permitted to set it down briefly before picking it back up. "We need to get back up there," she said. "Yeah," he agreed, "we do." The dog stayed against her legs as she moved toward the stairwell. She didn't tell him to stay. She didn't think it would work if she did. Above them, in the main building of the Kestrel Point K9 Heritage Auction, something was happening that Victor Hale had not prepared for. The kind of thing that, once it started, didn't stop until it had gone all the way to the end. Sloane climbed the stairs with her hand on the dog's back. She had no idea yet how far this was going to go, but she had been in enough emergency rooms, in enough situations that looked unwinnable from the inside, to know that the moment you found the thing you were looking for, the one real piece of evidence that everything else was built around, the situation changed fundamentally. She had found it. Now she needed to figure out what was waiting for her at the top of the stairs. The voices above them got louder, and then, from somewhere outside the building, came the sound of vehicles, more than one, moving fast on gravel, and the specific, unmistakable sound of radio transmissions carrying across a parking lot at high volume. Sloane stopped at the top step. Devlin was right behind her. She felt him tense, not in fear, in recognition. "Government plates," he said quietly. "How many?" Sounded like 3 vehicles, maybe 4. She looked at him. He looked at her. The hatch swung open above them, and a face appeared. A young woman with short hair and a federal badge on a lanyard. "Is there a Sloane Merritt down there?" she asked. "That's me," Sloane said. "Special Agent Della Price, NCIS." She held the badge where Sloane could see it clearly. "We received an anonymous tip about this facility 48 hours ago, and we've been building a warrant since. Your call to the USDA this morning accelerated our timeline." She looked at the dog pressed against Sloane's legs, then at the sublevel behind them. Are there animals down there? 8, Sloane said. Several need immediate veterinary attention. Price turned to someone behind her and gave an instruction Sloane couldn't fully hear. Then she looked back down. Ms. Merritt, I'm going to need you to come up and give me a statement, and I'm going to need you to not touch anything else until our forensic team gets here. The dog stays with me, Sloane said. Price looked at the German Shepherd, assessed something, and nodded once. Fine. Sloane came up the stairs and into the chaos of the main building, where 3 NCIS agents were already moving through the crowd, separating people by the quality of their discomfort, and where Victor Hale was standing near the registration table with an expression that had finally run out of calculations and landed on something flat and unreadable. He was looking at Sloane. She was looking at the dog she was holding, running her thumb along the edge of his collar, along the ridge where the leather was slightly thicker than it should have been, the kind of thickness that came from something being sewn inside it rather than just being part of the original construction. She didn't say anything about it yet, but her hand stayed there, because a collar that someone had gone to the trouble of hiding something inside of was the kind of thing you didn't draw attention to until you understood exactly what you were holding and exactly who else knew it existed. Agent Price was waiting. The room was full of federal agents and witnesses and 30 dogs that had just been given a temporary reprieve from a sale that should never have happened. And the man who had built this entire operation was watching Sloane Merritt with the specific attention of someone who had just realized, too late, that she hadn't come here just to find a dog. She'd come here because she already knew what was inside the collar. She just needed the dog to confirm she had the right one. The collar was the kind of thing you learned to make in a field where carrying a separate evidence pouch was a liability. Sloane had made one herself once, 6 years ago, using a surgical needle and braided nylon thread from a medical kit. She'd sewn a folded piece of waterproof film into the interior lining of a dog's collar because the handler carrying it had said, quietly, the night before a mission that had no margin for error, if something happens to me, the dog comes home. Make sure someone can read what's on him. The handler's name had been Marcus Tully. Marcus had not come home. She had been told the dog hadn't either. She stood in the chaos of the Kestrel Point main floor, with her hand resting at the base of the German Shepherd's neck, thumb tracing the ridge in the leather that no one else in the room had noticed, because no one else knew what they were looking for. Agent Price was 3 feet away waiting for her statement. Victor Hale was 15 feet away being separated from the crowd by 2 NCIS agents who kept their posture between him and every exit without making it look deliberate. Devlin Reyes had come up from the sublevel behind her and was giving his own preliminary statement to a second agent near the registration table. Sloane needed 30 seconds of not being watched. She didn't have them. Ms. Merritt? Price had the tone of someone who was being patient because patience was tactically useful, not because she was naturally inclined toward it. I need you with me. I know. Sloane released the collar. Let's go. She kept the dog at her left leg, not on a leash, just moving with her, which he did without instruction, staying close enough that their strides were synchronized. Price watched this and said nothing, which meant she was either observant enough to clock it as significant or too focused on the operational situation to process it yet. They moved to a quieter section of the building near the east wall, away from the main kennel rows, where the background noise dropped enough for a coherent conversation. Price produced a small recording device in addition to taking notes on her phone. For the record, your full name, your professional role, and how you came to be at this facility today. Sloane Merritt, trauma nurse, Dunmore Regional Medical Center. I received an anonymous document 3 days ago, a sale manifest for this auction that listed an animal under a name and lot number I recognized as inconsistent with military K9 records from a deployment I was involved with in 2018. Price's expression didn't change. You were in the military. Navy. I was a K9 medical specialist attached to SEAL team operations from 2015 to 2019. I was medically separated after an operational incident that was classified at the time, and as far as I know remains classified. And the dog? Sloane looked down. The German Shepherd was sitting at her left, watching the room with the alert stillness of an animal that was tracking multiple points of interest simultaneously and hadn't decided which one mattered most yet. His registered service name was Torch. He was partnered with Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tully. They were both listed as killed in action following a mission in the Farhan Valley region in March 2019. I was the attending K9 medical specialist. I was not on that mission. I was told they didn't make it out. She paused. The scar on his right flank. I sutured that wound myself, 8 weeks before the mission. It's not a pattern you'd find in a medical record because it was done in field conditions and logged as a minor tissue repair. But I know it. Price wrote something. You're saying this animal was reported dead and is here being sold under a different name. Under at least 2 different names, depending on which manifest you're reading. The one I received listed him as Lot 14 under the name Ranger. Inside the building, he's listed as Lot 22 under the same name. Neither of those is his name. She paused. And the microchip number on his kennel card doesn't match the registration I have for him. You have his original registration. I photographed the records before I separated. I had reason to. Price looked at her steadily. There was something in the look that wasn't quite skepticism and wasn't quite acceptance. It was the professional suspension of judgment that good investigators maintained while their internal probability assessment ran quietly in the background. What reason? She asked. Because the mission briefing that sent Marcus Tully into the Farhan Valley came from a procurement office that had been flagged internally for financial irregularities 6 months earlier. I raised a concern through proper channels. I was medically separated 4 weeks after the mission. The 2 events may not be connected. Sloane met Price's eyes directly. But I've had 6 years to think about it. The agent wrote for a longer period this time. Then she looked up. The collar. Sloane kept her face neutral. What about it? You've been touching it since you came up from the sublevel. You stopped touching it when I approached you. And you've been careful to position yourself so I can't see the interior lining. So Price was observant. The collar may contain documentation, Sloane said. I don't know yet. I haven't opened it. If it contains anything related to this investigation, I know. I'll give it to you. I just need to look at it first. Price studied her. Why? Because if Marcus left something in that collar, he left it for someone specific. And I need to know whether it's for me or whether it's for you before I decide how to hand it over. It was more honest than Sloane had intended to be, and she saw Price register it as such. The agent tapped her pen against her notebook twice, then said, 5 minutes. I'll be 6 feet away. Sloane crouched beside the dog. He turned to look at her immediately, ears forward, his breathing regular but watchful. She worked the collar's interior lining with her thumbnail, found the seam she'd felt through the leather, and applied careful pressure along it until the thread gave. The material inside was a folded piece of laminate film, the kind that didn't degrade with moisture, about 3 inches by 2. Sloane unfolded it carefully. It was dense. Handwritten in Marcus Tully's cramped, precise script, the handwriting of someone who had gone to the trouble of writing small so he could say more. 2 columns of numbers on one side, a short paragraph of text on the other, starting mid-thought, as if it were the continuation of a longer document she didn't have. Procurement codes cross-referenced to Hale Meridian Solutions, LLC, Shell Incorporated Cayman, 2017, K9 program contract awarded March 2018 through DoD subsidiary. Animals listed as euthanized transferred to HMS Staging Facility, Kestrel Point. Handler notification falsified. Recommend NCIS contact Investigator Braddock, Field Office, Pensacola. Full file with Tully M., Senior Chief, SEAL Team 6DT. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Agent Price. It's for you, she said. The next 4 hours were the kind of controlled chaos that looked, from the outside, like everything was falling apart, and was, from the inside, actually a system beginning to work the way systems were supposed to. NCIS forensic technicians arrived in a second wave 30 minutes after the initial agents, bringing equipment cases and the particular energy of people who had been waiting on a warrant to move and were now moving with significant focus. The 30 dogs upstairs were documented in place before any transfers were made, photographed, scanned for microchips, cross-referenced against a database that an agent at a folding table near the entrance was running on a laptop that had clearly been configured before anyone arrived at this location. The 8 dogs in the sublevel were brought up one by Dr. Nadia Farr and an animal welfare officer who had arrived with the second NCIS team, and each one was assessed, documented, and moved to a temporary holding area that Fowler was organizing with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided this was her problem now and was not going to wait for someone to assign it to her. Victor Hale had been separated from the crowd and was sitting in a folding chair near the main entrance with an NCIS agent sitting across from him. He hadn't said anything since his initial response to Price's opening questions, which had been one sentence delivered in a careful, practiced tone. "I'd like my attorney present before we continue." Everything since had been silence, with the specific texture of a man who had enough legal infrastructure in place to know that silence was currently his best option. Devlin Reyes had given his statement and was now helping where he could, not pushing into the federal team's operational space, but making himself useful in the specific way of someone who understood operational environments and knew instinctively where the gaps were. He'd found bolt cutters and was helping move the sub-level kennels up the stairwell. He'd located the facility's water supply and made sure all the animals had access. Small things, the kind of things that needed doing. Sloane was sitting on an overturned equipment crate near the east wall, the German Shepherd at her feet, reviewing the laminate document one more time before she handed it to Price's team. She was trying to memorize it, not because she didn't trust NCIS to handle it properly. She'd read Price clearly enough to believe the agent was competent and straight, but because she had spent 6 years not knowing, and she wasn't ready to hand the knowing entirely to someone else. Devlin sat down on a crate beside her without asking, which she found she didn't mind. "That the thing from the caller?" he asked. "Yes." "Does it help?" "It names the company that ran the procurement contract, and it names an NCIS investigator Marcus specifically wanted contacted." She folded the laminate carefully. "He wrote this knowing someone would eventually find it. He planned for the possibility that he wasn't coming back." Devlin was quiet for a moment. "What was he like?" It wasn't phrased as a question exactly, and she didn't answer it like one. "Careful, precise. He made exactly one joke per shift, and it was always bad on purpose." She looked at the dog. "He talked to Torch the way some people talk to a partner they've worked with for 20 years, like there was an ongoing conversation and the dog was keeping up with it." She paused. "He probably was." "My partner's name was Garrett Hollis," Devlin said. "His dog was a Malinois named Sable. I found her kennel card downstairs. She's one of the 8. "Sable's the one with the eye injury?" "Partial vision loss, right eye. Garrett's after-action report mentioned she'd taken fragmentation in that eye during an IED incident. They cleared her for continued service after treatment. The records down here show the injury as pre-existing condition, origin unknown." His voice was even, which took a certain kind of effort. Someone deliberately obscured how she got hurt to make the military liability trail harder to follow. Sloane looked at him. "Garrett didn't make it back." "No." "I'm sorry." "Yeah." He scrubbed a hand across his jaw. "Me too." They sat with that for a moment in the way that people who had both been in proximity to a certain kind of loss were able to sit with it. Not performing grief, just holding the real weight of it for a second before moving forward, because forward was the only direction that served anything. The escalation came from an unexpected direction, as the worst ones usually did. It started with a phone call that Agent Price took 20 feet from Sloane's position, turning slightly away but not far enough. Sloane caught fragments. "Braddock's name is on it." "Yes, sir." The procurement angle goes, "Are you sure about the timeline?" And then Price's voice dropped completely, and she walked to the far corner of the building and stayed there for several minutes. When she came back, she looked different, not rattled. Price didn't do rattled, at least not on the surface, but reorganized, the way someone looked when new information had forced them to rebuild their situational map from scratch. "Miss Merritt," the investigator named in that document, "Braddock." The one Marcus specified. "He retired from NCIS field operations in 2021. He's currently a civilian contractor with DoD oversight." She paused. "He's also listed as the certifying official on 14 of the 30 animal records upstairs." The room seemed to shift slightly, the way rooms did when a piece of information rearranged the architecture of what you thought you were looking at. "He certified the records," Sloane said carefully, "the falsified ones. His signature appears on the vet documentation for multiple animals whose microchip registrations, when cross-referenced with our database, correspond to military canines that were officially reported as deceased in the 2019-2021 operational period." Price's voice was controlled. which means the investigator your colleague specifically asked us to contact may be directly connected to the operation we're investigating. Devlin had gone still beside Sloane. Marcus didn't know, Sloane said. It came out flat because it had to. When he wrote that document, Braddock was a legitimate NCIS investigator. He was pointing us towards someone he trusted. Possibly, or Braddock turned after 2019, or was compromised, or the recommendation itself was a test that Marcus built in because he wanted to see if Braddock's name would surface in whatever investigation eventually happened. She looked at Price. He was careful. He was precise. He thought 8 moves ahead. I don't know which it is. Price closed her notebook. We're going to need to widen this significantly. How much wider? DOD Inspector General's office, possibly JAG. She said it with the kind of steadiness that came from accepting an unwelcome reality rather than from feeling good about it. If a former NCIS investigator is involved in falsifying military death records and facilitating the illegal transfer of government property, and that's what these animals are, legally, they're government property, then we're not looking at a local fraud operation anymore. You never were, Devlin said quietly. This required access to classified operational records to pull off. You need to know when dogs are being decommissioned, which handlers have died, which missions are classified enough that no one's going to ask follow-up questions. That's not something Victor Hale built from a business license in a livestock barn. Price looked at him. You came to this auction because of a manifest you received anonymously. Yes. Did you investigate the company running the event before you arrived? I looked up what I could find publicly. Hale Meridian Solutions, LLC, registered in 2017, incorporated out of state, secondary office listed in Kestrel Point. The LLC structure was clean, nothing obviously flagged. But the DoD contract listed on their public filings was awarded through a subsidiary channel that I couldn't trace publicly. He paused. I'm a former SEAL, not a forensic accountant. I found the edge of it and stopped. The name in that document, Sloane said, Hale Meridian Solutions. That's Victor Hale's company. Yes. Which means the procurement contract that gave this operation access to military K-9 decommissioning records was held by the same person running the auction. She thought for a moment. He didn't just exploit the system. He built himself into the system. He had a legitimate contract, legal access, official standing. The fraud was layered inside something that looked like a real operation because it was a real operation, just with a second set of books running underneath it. Price's phone rang again. She looked at the screen, and this time she moved away without the pretense of staying within earshot. Sloane watched her go and read the posture. Something had changed again, and not in a direction that made the next hour simpler. The crowd from the auction had been divided into 3 groups by this point. People with no apparent connection to the operation, casual buyers, collectors, a few legitimate service dog trainers, had been asked to provide contact information and were being released with an instruction to remain available. People whose financial records showed significant prior transaction history with Hale Meridian Solutions were being held for further questioning. And a third group, smaller, 4 individuals, including 2 men who had arrived as handlers for specific animals, were being treated with the particular careful attention that suggested they were not going to be leaving today. Victor Hale had not moved from his folding chair. He had, at some point in the last hour, stopped watching Sloane and started watching the door, which meant his attorney had given him a revised estimated arrival time, and he was holding on to that number like a fixed point. Sloane didn't think it was going to be enough. She'd seen how Price moved through this space, and she understood that the agent had come here with more than a warrant. She'd come with preparation. The 48 hours between the anonymous tip and today had been used well. She was thinking about this when Dr. Four appeared at her elbow, slightly breathless and carrying a tablet. I need to show you something. Sloane stood. The dog stood with her. Four pulled up a screen showing a grid of microchip registration numbers. I've been cross-referencing the numbers I photographed against the AVMA Military Working Dog Database. It's public-facing, limited information, but it shows registration status. 38 animals in this facility. 38 microchip numbers. She pointed at the grid. 11 of these numbers are registered as belonging to animals that are currently listed as deceased, not retired. Deceased, meaning their records were closed, their files were archived, and officially they don't exist anymore. But they're here. They're here. And 6 of these numbers appear twice, once in the official deceased registry and once in the current auction catalog under different names. Someone created duplicate registration codes. You'd need system-level access to the DoD Veterinary Records Network to do that. Braddock, Devlin said from Sloane's other side. If he had that level of access, yes. Ford lowered the tablet. But here's the thing. 3 of the duplicate registrations are for animals that the auction catalog lists as having been acquired through a separate organization, a nonprofit called the Veterans Legacy Working Dog Fund. It's listed as the transfer organization on the sale documents. She paused. I looked it up while we were waiting. The nonprofit is registered in this state, and the registered agent listed is a name I didn't recognize. But the address for the registered office is this facility, the same building we're standing in. Sloane absorbed this. Hale set up a nonprofit to act as the legal transfer point. It created an official-looking paper trail from military decommissioning to private sale. With a legitimate-sounding name that any cursory check would accept without digging deeper, Ford said. The Veterans Legacy Working Dog Fund sounds exactly like the kind of organization that should be handling this. It sounds responsible. It sounds like someone cared. Because that's what it was designed to sound like. She looked across the room at Victor Hale. He was watching her now, not with calculation anymore. With something closer to the assessment of a man who had decided he needed to understand the specific nature of the problem in front of him before his attorney arrived. He was trying to figure out what she knew. She held his look for a moment, then turned back to Ford. Send everything to Agent Price, she said. All of it. The grid, the duplicate registrations, the nonprofit filings. Screenshot everything. Already sending, Ford said. Devlin was looking toward the main entrance. Price is coming back. She was, and she had someone with her, a man Sloane hadn't seen before, tall, in a suit that was slightly too formal for a livestock facility, carrying a leather document case with the efficiency of someone who treated document cases the way surgeons treated instrument trays. He had the particular bearing of federal law enforcement that came from JAG or the Inspector General's office, the kind of authority that existed above the operational level and dealt in the architecture of accountability rather than its execution. He stopped near Sloane and Devlin without introduction, looked at them both with the practiced assessment of a man who had read files before he arrived, and then looked at the dog. Senior Chief Tully's K9, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Sloane said. I'm Deputy Inspector General Marcus Ardell, DOD. He opened the document case. We've had an ongoing investigation into Hale Meridian Solutions for 14 months. This auction accelerated our timeline in ways we weren't prepared for. He produced a document. Miss Merritt, the classified incident report from the Farhan Valley mission in 2019, the one that resulted in the listing of Senior Chief Tully and his K9 as killed in action, was reviewed by our office 8 months ago. There were irregularities in the operational record that we flagged for further investigation, including one that we couldn't explain at the time. He handed her the document. It was a single page, heavily redacted, but the section at the bottom was clear. The mission report listed 2 casualties, Marcus Tully, and the K9 designated as Torch. In the original submission, before it was amended, both were listed as wounded in action with a recovery status of uncertain. The amendment, filed 6 weeks later, changed both to killed in action. The amendment was signed by a certifying official. The certifying official was named Braddock. Sloane read it twice. Then she looked up. He was alive, she said. After the mission. Marcus was alive. For approximately 3 weeks, according to the original medical report filed before the amendment. Ardell's voice was level in the way of someone delivering information they understood would land hard. He died in a facility that we're still working to identify. The amendment was filed to close his record and prevent anyone from asking why a deceased service member was still receiving medical treatment. The room had gotten quieter around them. Not because people were listening, the room was still full of operational noise, but because Sloane had gone somewhere internal that required the external world to simply wait. Marcus had survived the mission, had survived long enough to write something, had sewn it into his dog's collar because he understood that the dog was the one piece of evidence no one would think to look at, and the one living thing that might actually make it somewhere safe. He had trusted the dog to carry it. He had trusted that someone would eventually know what to look for. Devlin put a hand on her shoulder briefly. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. She folded the document and handed it back to Ardell. "What do you need from me?" "A full debrief," he said. "Everything you know about the Farhan Valley mission, the K-9 program structure during your service period, your contact history with Senior Chief Tully, and the circumstances of your medical separation." He paused. "I should tell you, based on what we've developed over 14 months, and based on the document recovered from that caller, there's a reasonable evidentiary basis to believe your medical separation was not the result of the incident officially cited in your record." She looked at him steadily. "You're saying I was separated to remove me from proximity to whatever Marcus was about to report?" "We're saying there's a basis to examine that question." Across the room, Victor Hale had finally stood up from his folding chair. His attorney had arrived, a woman in a dark blazer who moved with the contained speed of someone billing by the minute and intending to earn it, and they were having a rapid, quiet exchange near the entrance. Agent Price was watching them. 2 other NCIS agents had repositioned without appearing to. Sloane watched Hale's attorney hand him a document, watched him read it, watched his expression. Do the thing that expressions did when the document said something different than expected. Not better, not worse, just different in a way that required rapid recalibration. "What did she just give him?" Devlin asked quietly. Ardell answered without looking. "A motion to transfer venue. His attorney is arguing that given the DoD classification angle, any charges should be processed through a military tribunal rather than civilian federal court." He closed his document case. "It's a delay tactic. It won't work, but it tells us something useful. That he knows about the classified operational angle," Sloane said. "That he's been prepared for it, which means someone told him we were coming." Ardell looked at her. "Someone with access to our investigation scope." The implication settled into the room like a temperature drop. Hale's attorney was speaking to Price now. Price was listening with the particular stillness of someone who was not going to give anything away through her body language. 2 of the NCIS agents had moved subtly toward the exits, and somewhere in the crowd of witnesses and detainees and federal officials, someone had known 14 months of investigative groundwork was being built against this operation, and had made sure Victor Hale had enough notice to prepare a legal strategy before the moment of arrest. Sloane looked at the dog at her feet. He looked back at her with the same steady attention he'd held for the past 2 hours. Marcus had known. He had known the system was compromised deeply enough that a straightforward report to his chain of command wasn't safe. He had known the only way to get the information out was to make it impossible to find until someone who understood what they were looking for came along to do exactly that. He had spent whatever time he had left setting up the conditions for a truth that would arrive years after he couldn't. She reached down and put her hand on the dog's head. "We need to talk about your investigation's internal security," she said to Ardell, without looking up. "Yes," he said. "We do." From the entrance, Victor Hale's attorney turned back toward her client with an expression that was no longer performing confidence. Whatever Price had said in response to the venue motion had landed differently than expected. Hale looked up. He looked at Sloane across the entire width of the room, and for the first time she could see in his face what she had been waiting for since she walked into this building. Not quite fear, but the thing that lived right next to it. The recognition that the specific person you had underestimated had turned out to be the one you couldn't afford to. He looked away first. Devlin leaned in slightly. Price just handcuffed one of the handler group near the south wall, quietly. The guy isn't even reacting. Sloane looked. He was right. The man was being guided toward a side door with NCIS agents on either side in the practiced, low-drama style of professionals who wanted this to happen without triggering a scene. "That's not one of Hale's handlers," she said. Devlin studied the man's posture for a second. "No, he's not." "He's the source," she said. "He's the one who warned Hale. Price figured it out. How do you know?" She watched the man's face as he was moved toward the door, watched the specific quality of his composure, which wasn't the composure of someone caught, but the composure of someone who had known this moment was coming and had made peace with it in advance. "Because he's not trying to talk his way out," she said. "He came here to watch it end." And in the man's right hand, hanging at his side in the casual grip of someone who wanted it accessible but not obvious, was a small evidence bag, already sealed. already labeled in the cramped, precise handwriting of someone who had spent years making things legible under difficult conditions. Someone who had prepared for the possibility that he wasn't going to be able to deliver it himself. Sloane's chest did something complicated. The man looked up as he reached the door, and for 1 second his eyes found hers across the room. And she understood, with the particular clarity of a recognition that comes too late to do anything except receive it, that Marcus Tully had not worked alone. He'd left more than one person to carry the evidence forward. The door closed. And Agent Price, turning back towards the center of the room with an expression that was the closest thing to urgency Sloane had seen on her face all day, raised her hand and said, in a voice that cut clean through the operational noise, "I need everyone to stop what they're doing." The room stopped. The way rooms stopped when someone with genuine authority said something that made everyone recalibrate simultaneously. Not a freeze, but a collective reorientation, bodies turning toward the voice, hands lowering, conversations cutting off mid-syllable. Price stood at the center of the floor with her phone still in her hand, and her expression carrying the specific quality of someone who had just received information that changed the operational shape of everything around her. She looked at Ardell first, then at Sloane, then at the NCIS team positioned around the room. "The individual we just took into custody," she said, at normal volume but with the carrying precision of someone trained to be heard clearly in loud environments, was carrying a second evidence package, sealed, photographed before removal. "It contains documentation we did not know existed." She paused. "Everyone who has been involved in processing this scene, I need you to hold your current positions and current evidence until I've gone through what we just recovered. Nothing moves, nothing transfers, nothing gets logged further until I give clearance." The forensic team stopped. The animal welfare officer, who had been preparing to begin the formal transfer process for the sub-level dogs, set her clipboard down. Even Hale's attorney, who had been composing something on her phone with the focused irritation of someone billing for obstructed time, looked up. Ardell moved toward Price without urgency, but without hesitation. They spoke quietly for less than a minute. Sloane watched Ardell's face during it, watched the controlled processing of a man who had been running an investigation for 14 months and had just been handed a piece he hadn't known was missing. He came back to Sloane. "The man we just took into custody," he said. "Do you know him?" She had been thinking about this since the door closed. The handwriting on the evidence bag. The composure of someone who had made peace with what was coming. "I don't know his name, but I think Marcus trusted him with a parallel copy of whatever he left in the caller. A backup, in case the caller never reached anyone who knew what it was. His name is Warrant Officer Deshaun Pelham. He separated from service in 2020, officially for personal reasons. He's been living in Kestrel Point for 8 months. Ardell let that sit for a second. 8 months. Which is when this facility began its operational preparation for today's auction. He came here to watch. He came here because he needed to see it end." Ardell's voice was flat, not cold, the flatness of a man managing his own response to information that carried weight. "He made contact with our office 2 weeks ago through a third-party attorney. I was in the process of arranging a formal meeting. Today accelerated that." "What's in the second package?" "Financial records. Wire transfer documentation between Hale Meridian Solutions and 3 offshore accounts. And a name." He looked at her directly. "The name of the DoD contracting officer who approved the original K9 program transfer agreement in 2018. The one that gave Hale Meridian Solutions legal access to military working dog decommissioning." Sloane waited. "Colonel Reginald Farr," Ardell said, "currently serving as Deputy Director of Acquisition Policy, DoD, Pentagon." The scale of it arranged itself in Sloane's head with the clinical clarity of a diagnosis. The moment when scattered symptoms aligned into a pattern that explained everything and made nothing easier. This wasn't a livestock barn operation built by a fraudulent businessman exploiting a gap in oversight. This was a pipeline that ran from a Pentagon office, through a shell company, through a nonprofit, through an auction floor, and it had been running for years. And it had been protected at a level high enough that an NCIS investigator had been turned and a decorated Navy SEAL had been left to die in an unidentified facility because he'd gotten too close to the architecture of it. Farr approved the contract, she said, and based on the wire transfers Pelham documented, Farr received compensation through one of the offshore accounts for a period of 4 years. Ardell opened his case again and produced a second document. We've been building toward Hale. We did not have far. This changes the scope significantly. Significantly was the kind of word that people in federal law enforcement used when they meant completely, because completely created liability they weren't ready to articulate yet. What happens now? Devlin asked. He'd been standing close enough to hear all of it without inserting himself, which Sloane had noted as the behavior of someone who understood when to hold position. FAR will be notified through proper channels, Ardell said. A flag will be placed on his access credentials within the next, he checked his watch, 40 minutes, possibly less, depending on how quickly the IG's office can move the internal process. 40 minutes, Devlin said. That's enough time for someone to tip him off. Yes, Ardell said. It is. He said nothing else, which meant he was aware of it, and it was already someone else's problem to manage. And the problem of a man at Sloane's level raising it was that there was nothing she could do about it except know it was a risk. She looked across the room at Victor Hale. His attorney was no longer typing. She was reading something on her phone with the focused stillness of someone receiving news that required rapid strategic revision. Someone already told her, Sloane said quietly. Ardell followed her gaze. Possibly. Not possibly. Look at her hands. The attorney's left hand, which had been holding the phone, had tightened its grip. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that only registered if you spent your professional life reading physical responses in people who were trying not to show them. She's adjusting her strategy, Sloane said. She came here prepared to fight a local fraud charge. What she just received changed the shape of what she's defending against. Ardell turned to look at Price, who was still working through the second evidence package across the room. He caught her eye and held it for 2 seconds, and some communication passed between them that didn't require words. Price nodded once, then walked toward Hale's attorney. What happened in the next 20 minutes was the controlled acceleration of a situation that had been building for 14 months, and had now reached the point where the only variable left was how much damage each party was going to sustain on the way down. Hale's attorney made 3 phone calls in succession, stepping outside between each one, and each time she came back in, her expression had shed another layer of the professional composure she'd arrived with. By the 3rd call, she looked like a woman who was revising her fee structure in real time. Hale sat back down in his folding chair. He didn't look at Sloane anymore. He was looking at a fixed point on the floor approximately 4 feet in front of him, which was the look of a man processing a situation that had stopped being manageable and hadn't yet resolved into what it was going to become instead. The 38 dogs in the building were still present, still waiting, still carrying the particular patience of animals that had been trained to wait through things that would have broken a human being. Dr. Fayeur had managed to get water to all of them and had done a triage pass on the 8 from the sublevel, documenting her findings with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that every observation she made right now was going to matter to someone's case. The Malinois with the partial eye injury, Sable, was lying in a temporary kennel near the east wall, with her head resting on her paws, watching the room. Devlin had positioned himself nearby without making a production of it, and occasionally reached a hand through the wire to let her sniff his knuckles, which she did each time with the same careful deliberation. Sloane noticed this and didn't say anything about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She was doing her own version of the same thing with Torch, sitting close, one hand resting against the wire of his temporary kennel, while Price's team continued their work, staying present in a way that required no words because neither of them needed words for it. The forensic team had located the facility's administrative office, a room at the back that Hale had used to run auction operations, and which turned out to contain a filing system of considerable sophistication. Not paper files mostly, but a server unit running proprietary database software that the forensic tech working on it described, without inflection, as not what you'd expect in a building that sells livestock equipment. The server was the engine of the operation. It contained 2 parallel record systems exactly as Sloane had theorized, one facing outward, formatted to satisfy any official inspection, and one internal tracking the actual identities, service histories, medical records, and chain of custody for every animal that had passed through Hale's network. The internal system went back to 2018. It named sources, transfer points, payment structures, and certifying officials. Braddock's name appeared 47 times. FAR's appeared 9 times, each in a transaction coded to one of the 3 offshore accounts. An NCIS forensic analyst came out of the administrative office and walked directly to Ardell. She said something at a register too low for Sloane to catch. Ardell's expression didn't change, but he stopped moving, which with him was the equivalent of someone else's sharp intake of breath. He turned to Sloane. "The internal system has a flag on your name," he said. "A watch alert set 18 months ago. Every week, an automated search ran against public records: nursing license, property records, vehicle registration, professional database entries." He paused. "Someone in this operation has been monitoring your location for a year and a half." The information arrived differently than she would have expected. Not as fear, she'd moved past the version of herself that went to fear, first somewhere around year 2 of nursing in a level 1 trauma center, where you either learned to process threat information functionally or you stopped being useful. It arrived instead as confirmation of something she'd half known without evidence, that her separation from service hadn't been the end of anyone's interest in her. It had just moved the monitoring to a quieter channel. "They knew I might eventually come looking," she said. "They wanted to know how close you were getting." Ardell's voice was careful. The watch alert had an escalation protocol attached. If your name appeared in any context connected to military K-9 records or NCIS activity, an automatic notification would be sent to— He checked the document the analyst had handed him. "An email address registered to a shell account that we're going to need time to trace." "Far," Devlin said. "Consistent with that," Ardell said, which was his way of saying yes without creating a premature evidentiary statement. Sloane thought about the anonymous envelope that had arrived at her home 3 days ago. The manifest. The timing of it. Sent with enough lead time for her to drive 4 hours, but not so much that she had time to involve anyone official. Sent in a way that couldn't be traced. Designed to get one specific person to one specific location at the moment it would be most useful. "Pelham sent me the envelope," she said. Ardell considered this. Almost certainly. He knew about the watch alert. He knew that if I started making official inquiries, the alert would fire and FAR would have warning. So he got me here without creating a traceable communication. He needed someone who would know what to look for without leaving the kind of digital trail that would trigger the system. He needed someone the system wasn't expecting, Ardell said. A nurse from a small city trauma center arriving in hospital scrubs without a buyer registration. Someone the security guard could dismiss without logging as a threat. Someone whose name, checked against a buyer list rather than the watch alert system, would return nothing and be forgotten. The most underestimated person in the room was, structurally, the safest vector for the information. Pelham had understood that. Marcus had understood it too, 6 years ago, when he sewed a piece of laminate film into a dog's collar instead of sending a report through a chain of command he didn't trust. The truth had traveled through the quietest possible channels to arrive here. The escalation came fast, the way the final stages of a compound fracture presented. Everything held, and then gave way in rapid sequence. The first signal was Price's phone. She answered it, listened for approximately 8 seconds, and then began moving toward Ardell with the specific velocity of someone who needed to cover distance without appearing to run. She pulled him aside. Sloane was 12 feet away and could read the shape of the exchange even without the words. Something had happened outside this building, and it had happened quickly enough that the 40-minute window Ardell had referenced was now irrelevant. She was beside them before she made the conscious decision to move. "Far?" she asked. Price looked at her with the evaluating glance of someone deciding whether to include a civilian in an operational conversation, then apparently decided the answer was yes because Sloane was already holding pieces of this that made exclusion logistically complicated. Far's office was contacted as part of the standard notification process for a DoD-level investigation flag. He was in a meeting. She paused. He excused himself from the meeting 17 minutes ago. His security detail reports that he stepped out to take a personal call. He hasn't returned. His phone is going to voicemail. The building processed this the way systems processed unexpected load. Everything continued functioning while simultaneously absorbing the implications of the new information. "He ran," Devlin said. "We don't know that yet," Price said, in the tone of someone who knew that. "He had the watch alert. When my name appeared in connection with this facility and NCIS activity, the alert would have fired automatically when we logged the scene," Ardell said. He didn't look particularly surprised. He looked like a man who had run probability assessments on this outcome and was now managing the version where the lower probability scenario had materialized. How long ago did you log the scene? Initial log was approximately 40 minutes after first arrival, the forensic team lead said from nearby. She'd been close enough to hear. Standard procedure. 40 minutes, plus the time for the system to process and send, plus however long FAR had taken to act on it. He's had over an hour, Sloane said. Yes. Where does he go? Devlin said. He was asking practically, not rhetorically. If a Pentagon-level official decides to run in the middle of a business day, what does that look like? He doesn't have a go bag in his office. He doesn't have a plane standing by. You'd be surprised, Ardell said quietly, which meant there were things about FAR's resources that the 14-month investigation had developed that he wasn't going to detail in a livestock facility in Kestrel Point, and Sloane understood that trying to get it from him right now wasn't the right use of the next 5 minutes. What she could do was think about what FAR would want most if he were running, not just distance. Distance was temporary. What he'd want was leverage, something that made pursuit more costly than capture, something that rebalanced the risk calculation for whoever was deciding how aggressively to come after him. The server, she said. Ardell and Price both looked at her. The internal database. If FAR built part of this operation, he knows what's on that server. He knows his name appears 9 times. He might also know what's not on it, what documentation exists outside this system, who else has copies, what he has in reserve that we don't. She looked at the administrator he'd want destroyed before we finish processing it. This is when he'd move on it. Not him personally, but someone he can reach. Price was already turning. She raised her voice to the forensic team lead. I need that server physically isolated from any network connection. Now. Cable, wireless, everything. And I need a secondary backup started immediately on a disconnected drive. Already isolated, the tech said. Standard procedure on seizure. I need a confirmation of that isolation, not your standard procedure. The tech moved back into the administrative office without argument. Devlin had his phone out. I'm getting a cell signal anomaly, he said. Someone in this building tried to connect to an external network 3 minutes ago through a mobile hotspot. The attempt failed. I've got a monitoring app running, Habit from the field. But the attempt was made. Price turned. From where in the building? Southeast quadrant, near where the second handler group is being held. The NCIS agents moved. Not running, controlled, purposeful movement that covered the distance fast without triggering the cascade of reactions that running would have produced in a room full of already stressed animals and civilians. The handler they reached was a young man, mid-20s, who was sitting against the wall with his phone face down on his knee and the expression of someone who had just done something and was hoping nobody had noticed. He had the lean, angular build of someone who did outdoor work and the kind of tan that came from working in it year-round. And he was looking at the approaching agents with the trapped calculation of someone running out of options in real time. The agent reached him before he could do anything useful with the phone. He didn't fight. He handed it over with the resignation of someone who had understood the probable outcomes before he made the attempt and had decided the attempt was worth it anyway. Price was beside him in 40 seconds. Who were you trying to reach? The young man said nothing. The connection attempt failed, she said. Whatever you were trying to send didn't go, which means whoever you were trying to protect doesn't have it yet, which means the conversation about what's on that phone and who you're connected to is still entirely in your interest to have with us rather than in front of a jury. He looked at the floor. I'm going to ask you once, Price said, then the window closes. He looked up. He was younger than he'd seemed from a distance, early 20s at most, with the look of someone who had gotten into something they'd understood was wrong, and had been living with that understanding long enough that relief and fear had become difficult to separate. I don't know where he went, the young man said. I swear. I was supposed to send a message if the operation got compromised. That was it. I didn't know what the rest of it was. What was the message? He hesitated. One word, just one word, to a number I had memorized. The word was migrate. Price looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Ardell. It's a predetermined signal, Ardell said. FAR already knew what to do when he received it. He had a plan prepared. I was already on his own phone. I need a flag on all travel infrastructure out of the capital region. I want commercial, charter, private registration. Yes, all of it. And I need a secondary team at Farr's residence in the next 20 minutes. He walked away from the group, voice dropping. Sloane stood in the middle of the floor and looked at the room around her. The forensic teams, the animals in their temporary kennels, the witnesses being processed, the remains of an auction that had been built on the erasure of living things, and was now coming apart in ways that went much further than anyone in this building had anticipated when they drove out to a livestock facility in Kestrel Point on a Saturday morning, torch pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his back without looking down. Devlin came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He had the qualities she'd noticed from the beginning, the ability to occupy space without requiring it to bend around him. "Do you think they'll get far?" he asked eventually. "I think a Pentagon official going missing in the middle of a business day, with federal agencies looking, doesn't stay missing for very long." She paused. "Whether they get him before he reaches something that makes the situation complicated, that I don't know." "Complicated like what?" "Like another country. Like materials he's been holding as insurance. Like an arrangement that took 14 months to build and might take longer to unwind even with the documentation we have." She looked at the administrative office door. "The database is evidence. The caller document is evidence. Pelham's package is evidence. But Farr spent 4 years profiting from a pipeline that reached the Pentagon, and people who build things like that usually build an exit at the same time they build the entrance." The forensic tech appeared in the doorway of the administrative office with an expression that broke Sloane's train of thought. "Agent Price." The tech's voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering information they needed to deliver without editorializing it. "The server is isolated, but the secondary backup is running into a problem." Price crossed the room in 8 steps. "What problem?" "The internal database has a partition on it I didn't see in the initial survey. It was formatted to look like unused space." The tech held up her tablet. "It's not unused, it's a secondary archive, and it's larger than the primary internal database. Significantly larger. Whatever Hale was running on the visible system, the archive contains operational records that go back to 2016, 2 years before the contract was formally awarded. 2 years before the K9 procurement agreement that gave Hale Meridian Solutions its official access." "The operation started before the contract," Sloane said. She was close enough to hear. "The contract was the formalization. The actual operation started earlier." "Which means there are animals in this database whose transfers predate what we thought was the start of the pipeline," Price said. She looked at the forensic tech. "Can you access the archive?" "That's the other thing." The tech's voice stayed flat. "The archive is encrypted, separately from the rest of the system. It has a different key and we don't have it." "Hale," Devlin said. "His attorney will spend a week fighting a compelled decryption order," Price said. "And if the key lives outside the country, the order is meaningless." "Farr might have it," Ardell said, returning from his call. "If the archive covers the full operational period, Farr would have needed access. A man who just ran has very little incentive to hand us a decryption key." "There might be a third copy," Sloane said. Everyone looked at her. "Marcus left one copy in the caller. Pelham carried a second. Marcus was precise. He was careful. He built redundancy." She looked at Torch. "I don't think he left 2 copies. I think he left 3. She crossed the room to Price, who had the laminate document from the caller in an evidence bag. "Let me look at it again." Price handed her the bag without removing the document. Sloane held it up and read the 2 columns of numbers on the reverse side, the ones she'd taken in quickly the first time and told herself she'd return to. She hadn't had time. She had time now. The numbers in the left column were the procurement codes that matched the Hale Meridian Solutions contract. She'd recognized that on first reading. The right column she'd assumed was a parallel reference set. She'd read them as correlates. They weren't. They were different. Not procurement codes. The format was wrong for that. The structure was closer to a coordinate notation or a filing reference, or... She stopped. "These are NCIS evidence locker codes," she said. Price took the bag from her hands and looked. Her expression shifted slightly. "You're sure?" "The format matches what I was trained to recognize when I processed operational evidence during my service. 6 digits, 2 letters, 4 digits. That's NCIS evidence classification format." She pointed at the right column. 7 entries. 7 separate evidence submissions. Marcus was filing things. Before the mission. He was building a case and submitting it through official channels using a system he trusted enough to leave a record of. Filed to which field office? Price asked, but her voice had already changed, the flatness of active processing replacing the managed uncertainty of a moment before. That's what I don't know, Sloane said, but the certifying receipt number would show the office. And if those submissions are still in the system, they're retrievable, Price said. She was already dialing. If they haven't been archived or purged, if Braddock didn't access them and remove them from the active system. She put the phone to her ear and turned away. Devlin looked at Sloane. How long does a retrieval take? I don't know. Depends on the office, the archive system, whether anyone's touched the files since they were submitted. And whether Braddock got there first, he said. Yes, she said, and whether Braddock got there first. Across the room, Hale had looked up from his fixed point on the floor. He was watching Price on the phone with the expression of a man trying to assess whether what he was watching was bad for him without having enough information to know for certain. His attorney was watching Price too, and her face was doing something more informative than Hale's. The specific recalculation of a legal professional who was revising the charge landscape and finding it significantly broader than her initial brief had prepared her for. Price turned around. She was holding her phone against her chest, not ending the call, but pausing it. One of the 7 submissions is still in the active NCIS evidence system, she said. Submitted under a sealed case number by a confidential source in March 2019. The submission date is 3 days before the Farhan Valley mission. 3 days before he went in, he'd submitted the evidence, sent the dog out with a physical backup, and walked into a mission that someone in his chain of command had compromised. What's in it? Sloane asked. I won't know for another 20 to 40 minutes. It's in a field office archive that requires secondary authorization to access, and the authorization process. Price stopped. Something had happened on the phone she was holding. She lifted it back to her ear. Listened. Her jaw tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. She ended the call. The field office archive that holds the submission, she said. Someone accessed it remotely 11 minutes ago. Attempted to delete the submission. She looked at Ardell. The deletion was blocked by the system's automatic backup protocol. The file is intact. But someone tried, Devlin said. Someone with field office credentials tried. She looked around the room, and for the first time Sloane saw something in Price's face that was beyond professional management. Not fear, not panic, but the genuine focused urgency of a person who understood that the ground was shifting under an investigation she'd been building for over a year, and that the shifting was happening faster than any of her contingencies had fully prepared for. Braddock, Sloane said. His credentials are still active, Ardell said, and this time the flatness in his voice was the flatness of a man who had made an error in process and was not going to spend time on self-recrimination when there was still time to limit the damage. He was placed on administrative hold, not system lockout. I assumed. The deletion failed, Sloane said. The file is still there. Yes. Then we still have it. For now, Price said. But Braddock knows it's there, knows we know, and knows his credentials just created a forensic trail directly back to him, which means whatever he's going to do next, he's going to do it in the next hour, because that's the window before the investigation around that access attempt closes. Sloane looked at Torch, and then at the administrative office where the server sat with its encrypted archive, and then at the sealed evidence bag with Marcus's handwriting on it, and then at Devlin, who was watching the exits with the same quiet, cataloging attention he'd applied to everything else since she'd first noticed him in the auction crowd. Where's Braddock? She asked. Ardell checked his phone. Last confirmed location was DoD contractor facility in the capital region. That was 90 minutes ago. 90 minutes was enough driving time to reach Kestrel Point. The realization moved through the room without anyone saying it out loud. Sloane could see it cross Price's face and Ardell's and land in the bodies of the 2 NCIS agents nearest the exits, who both shifted their weight and reassessed their sight lines without being told to. And then, from outside the building, came the sound of a single vehicle moving fast on gravel, headlights sweeping through the high windows as it turned into the lot and stopped hard. And then nothing. No door. No movement. Just a vehicle parked at the edge of the lot, with its engine running and its headlights cutting across the wall of a building full of federal agents and 38 military dogs and one nurse from a small city trauma center who had driven 4 hours on no sleep and had found every piece of the thing she'd come looking for, and was now standing in the middle of it trying to figure out if the man outside had come to surrender what he knew or to make sure that nobody inside ever used it. Nobody moved for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was long enough for Sloane to count the exits she could see, assess the distance between her position and the nearest NCIS agent, calculate that Torch was going to follow her regardless of what she did next, and decide that the worst thing anyone in this building could do right now was react before they understood what they were reacting to. Price was already moving, not toward the door, but toward the 2 agents nearest the exterior wall, giving instructions in a voice low enough that it didn't carry. The agents repositioned without urgency, which was the professional version of urgency that people who'd done this long enough had learned to use, because visible urgency created cascade reactions in crowds, and nobody wanted to manage that on top of everything else. Ardell was on his phone. Devlin had shifted his weight without appearing to move. He was now between Sloane and the nearest exterior wall, which she was fairly certain he hadn't done consciously. The headlights stayed on. The engine kept running. No door opened. "He's sitting in the vehicle," one of the agents near the window said, just loudly enough for Price to hear. "How many occupants?" "One visible. Driver's seat." Price processed this for a moment. "He drove here alone." "Appears so." A man who had just attempted to delete federal evidence from an NCIS archive system, who had 14 months of investigative groundwork building against him, who had been present in the operational infrastructure of a fraud scheme that now extended to the Pentagon. And he had driven himself to the location of the active federal operation, alone, and was sitting in the parking lot with his engine running. "He came to talk," Sloane said. Price looked at her. "If he wanted to run, he'd be running. If he came here to do something destructive, he would have done it before he stopped the car." She looked at the sweep of headlights through the high windows. "He's been carrying this for years. Pelham came here to watch it end. Braddock came here for something different." "He came here because he doesn't have anywhere else to go," Devlin said quietly. Not a contradiction, a completion. Price made a decision in the span of about 2 seconds. She turned to the agent nearest the main entrance. "Open the door, just the door. Hold position, don't advance." Then she looked at Sloane with an expression that was not quite asking permission and not quite issuing an instruction. "Stay back unless I bring you forward." Sloane stayed back. The main door opened. For a long moment, nothing happened. The engine in the parking lot continued running. The lights swept the wall. 38 military dogs were very quiet. Then the vehicle's engine cut off. A car door opened and closed. The man who walked through the entrance of the Kestrel Point facility was in his late 50s, heavy-set in the way of someone who had once been physically fit and had spent a long period of desk work changing that without fully accepting it. He was wearing a dark suit jacket over an open collar, and he was carrying nothing, hands visible and empty, which was deliberate and meant to be read as deliberate. His face carried the particular weathered quality of someone who had spent a long career in environments that required them to know things they couldn't talk about, and the exhaustion on it was the kind that sleep wouldn't fix. He stopped just inside the entrance and looked around the room until he found Price. "Leonard Braddock," he said. His voice was level. "I'm not armed. I'd like to speak with whoever's running this operation." "That's me," Price said. "Special Agent Della Price, NCIS. You're aware that your credentials were used to attempt access to a sealed evidence submission in our archive system approximately 25 minutes ago." "I'm aware," he said. "I made the attempt." "You're aware that the deletion failed." "I know." He looked at the room again, at the dogs, at the forensic teams, at Victor Hale sitting in his folding chair with his attorney beside him, at the careful positioning of the NCIS agents. He took all of it in the way someone took in a situation they had been imagining for a long time and were now seeing in its actual dimensions. "I didn't drive here to make anything harder for you. I drove here because there's something in that archived submission you're not going to understand without context, and I'm the only person left who can give you the context." Price looked at him steadily. "You tried to destroy it 25 minutes ago." "I tried to delete the part that would have gotten someone else killed," he said. "Not the evidence. One attachment. A contact list. Names of people who helped Marcus Tully build his case and are still alive and still don't know their names or in a federal evidence system." He paused. "I failed. Now you have it. Which means I need to get to you before you start running those names through standard channels. Because standard channels in this case Go through offices that are compromised and have been for 4 years. The room held its breath in the particular way of a space where everyone present was processing the same information from different angles and arriving at different preliminary conclusions. Price said, "Sit down, Mr. Braddock." They used the administrative office, which the forensic team had cleared enough floor space in to set up 2 folding chairs facing each other. Price went in with Braddock and a recording device. Ardell positioned himself near the door. Sloane stayed in the main room because she hadn't been invited, but she could hear enough through the open doorway to track the shape of it, and what she couldn't hear she could read in Ardell's posture as he monitored the exchange. Braddock had been recruited into the procurement fraud network in 2019. Not seduced by money, at least not initially, the leverage had been a different currency. His son, 23 at the time, had been in a financial situation that Farr's network had manufactured and then offered to resolve in exchange for cooperation. Standard construction. The kind of entry point that sophisticated operations used because it created compromised parties who were motivated to maintain the deception and who understood that exposure destroyed not just themselves, but someone they were protecting. He had certified the falsified veterinary records. He had provided access credentials that allowed Hale's network to cross-reference military K9 decommissioning schedules. He had not known, initially, that the animals being transferred were from active handler partnerships. He'd been told the program only involved legitimately decommissioned animals whose handlers had requested the transfers. By the time he understood the actual scope, the architecture of his own complicity made extraction feel impossible. Then Marcus Tully had contacted him, not as an investigator, not through official channels. Marcus had reached out the same way he'd done everything related to this operation, through a quiet channel that left no trace in any system Farr's network monitored. He'd told Braddock he knew. He'd also told Braddock he wasn't interested in destroying him. He was interested in the people above him. Braddock had spent 6 months helping Marcus build the case, feeding him the procurement codes, the transfer records, the offshore account structures. The information that ended up in the collar, in the laminate, had come partly from what Braddock had provided. Marcus had gone into the Farhan Valley knowing what he was walking into. He'd submitted everything he could through the sealed NCIS channel and left the physical backup on Torch, because he understood that if the mission went wrong, the official submission might be accessed and buried. The dog was insurance. Braddock was supposed to have kept the sealed submission protected until someone trustworthy could access it. He had. For 6 years, he'd kept Farr's network from learning about it by staying cooperative enough to avoid suspicion while never giving them the submission's case number. He had existed in the middle space of a man who had done genuinely wrong things and was using the time it bought him to limit what those things ultimately cost. The deletion attempt tonight had been the first time he'd reached for the system since 2019, and he'd done it wrong, panicked, moved too fast, accessed it in a way that left a forensic trail he should have known would be logged. The part of him that had been holding this for 6 years had broken when the watch alert fired, and he understood that Sloane Merritt was in this building and the operation was ending tonight. Sloane stood in the main room and listened to what she could hear of this, and she didn't feel what she'd expected to feel about Leonard Braddock. She didn't feel warmth toward him. He had certified the documents that erased living animals from the record and broken connections between handlers and partners, and he had done it for years. But she recognized the architecture of his situation with the clinical clarity of a trauma nurse who had spent a decade watching people make decisions under impossible pressure and then live in the structures those decisions created. He wasn't a good man who'd made a bad choice. He was a compromised man who had done real damage and had spent years doing the one insufficient thing he could still manage, keeping a door open that someone might eventually walk through. Marcus had walked through it. And Marcus had trusted him with the submission precisely because he understood what kind of person Braddock was. Not trustworthy in the clean sense, but trustworthy in the specific sense of someone whose self-preservation was now aligned with the survival of the evidence. It wasn't a heroic calculation. It was a human one. She looked at Torch. He was watching the administrative office door with the patient attention of an animal that understood something important was happening in there and had decided the best contribution he could make was to stay aware and stay close. The contact list in the archived submission contained 11 names. 7 of them were individuals who had provided logistical assistance to Marcus's case building, former service members, a military contractor analyst, a DoD administrative staffer who had flagged procurement irregularities through an internal channel and been told to drop it. None of them had known the full scope of what Marcus was building. Each had contributed a piece without knowing what the complete picture looked like. 3 of the names were current federal employees and agencies with oversight of the DoD contractor space. Ardell, once Braddock identified the specific offices, confirmed within 20 minutes that 2 of those 3 worked in departments that had regular contact with Farr's office. Whether that contact had compromised them or was coincidental, he couldn't determine in the building with the resources he had, but the names were now flagged at a level that meant they'd be handled through a channel that didn't run through Farr's network. The 11th name was Sloane's. She found out when Ardell came out of the administrative office and told her directly, which she appreciated because the alternative was finding out later, and that would have been worse. He put your name in the submission, he said, as a potential corroborating witness. He identified you as the K9 medical specialist who could verify Torch's physical history and confirm the surgical scar record. He was building toward eventually needing someone to make the medical identification that would prove the animals' identities had been falsified. Ardell paused. He anticipated the caller approach might not be sufficient on its own. He needed a human witness who had direct medical contact with the animal. He planned for me specifically, she said. You were the only person who'd done the suturing, the only person with the tactile knowledge to confirm that scar against a field condition record that doesn't exist in any database. He paused. He also noted in the submission that he was concerned about your safety if your name appeared in official channels prematurely. That's why he used your name in a sealed submission rather than in any open record. She stood with this for a moment. Marcus had kept her out of the line of fire for 6 years by keeping her name in a sealed container that only opened under the right conditions. He'd protected her the same way he'd protected the evidence, by hiding it inside something that looked like nothing important. He was careful, she said. Extremely, Ardell said. Where are we on Farr? The pause before his answer was 1 beat longer than his usual processing time, which told her the answer was complicated before he delivered it. His vehicle was located at a private airfield 60 miles outside the capital. The airfield has a charter service. A flight plan was filed this morning, before this operation began, for a destination in a non-extradition jurisdiction. He looked at her steadily. The flight left 2 hours and 12 minutes ago. The news landed the way bad clinical outcomes landed. Not with shock, because you'd known the possibility existed, but with the specific weight of a door closing on a version of the situation where everything resolved cleanly. He planned for this, she said. He planned for a scenario where the operation was compromised and he needed to exit. The flight plan was filed this morning, which means he had a threshold in place, some indicator that told him when to trigger it. And whatever that indicator was, it fired before we had him flagged for travel restriction. The watch alert, Devlin said. He'd come to stand nearby. When my name hit the system this morning, when Price logged the scene, that was his threshold. He built the watch alert as his own early warning system. That's our current assessment, Ardell said. Sloane looked at him. What non-extradition jurisdiction? I'm not going to tell you that. Because you don't know yet? Or because you're concerned about what I do with the information? He considered this with more honesty than she expected. Both, he said. She almost smiled. Fair. What she did instead of pursue an answer she wasn't going to get was go back to work, because the building was still full of animals that needed processing, and the investigation around her was operating at a pace that required functional human beings who knew what they were doing. Dr. Fauer had set up a medical assessment station near the north wall and was working through each of the 38 animals systematically, with the kind of methodical focus that Sloane recognized as the professional version of keeping yourself from thinking about the larger picture by concentrating on the thing directly in front of you. Sloane joined her without being asked, pulling on a pair of exam gloves that Four produced from her bag, and taking the animal welfare chart Four handed over. They worked side by side for an hour. Most of the animals were in better condition than their circumstances suggested they should be. Military working dogs were resilient, and the physiological compensation mechanisms of animals that had been trained under demanding conditions meant that stress manifested differently than it did in civilian animals. But several showed clear signs of inadequate care over an extended period. Weight loss inconsistent with age-related decline. Coat condition that spoke to nutritional gaps. One of the sub-level animals, a Dutch shepherd who would have been in peak condition 2 years earlier, had a low-grade respiratory infection that had been progressing untreated. Sloane noted everything in the chart with the same clinical precision she applied in the emergency room at Dunmore Regional. Observation, assessment, documentation. The work of someone who understood that what you recorded in this room today would be used by other people in other rooms for months, and the quality of the record determined the quality of what followed. Torch stayed at her left leg throughout, moving when she moved, stopping when she stopped, navigating the space between kennel stations and medical equipment with the practiced ease of an animal that had spent years working in close coordination with a human partner and had simply resumed that coordination as if the intervening years were a gap to be acknowledged and then set aside. She had not thought yet about what came next for him in the practical sense, where he went, what his legal status was, how the process of restoring his proper identity and record worked through a federal system that was now involved in an investigation of considerable scope. She was a trauma nurse from Dunmore Regional who had driven 4 hours on no sleep and was now technically a named witness in a federal evidence submission related to a DoD-level fraud investigation. The next several weeks were going to require some calendar adjustments. Devlin appeared at her elbow while she was completing the assessment chart on the 9th animal. "Sable's temperature is normal," he said. Fayeur checked her twice. "The eye?" "4 thinks it's been stable for a while. The vision loss isn't new damage, it's old damage that wasn't treated properly at the time and then adapted around." He paused. She said the dogs compensated well, adjusted her sight lines, modified her tracking behavior. 4 said she'd seen it before in working dogs. They adapt faster than people expect. "They do," Sloane agreed. Devlin was quiet for a moment, then, "What happens to her now?" He phrased it the same way he'd asked about Marcus. Not a question exactly, the syntax of someone working through something rather than requesting information. "She goes into the federal evidence hold temporarily while ownership is legally determined. Given that her handler is deceased and she was fraudulently transferred, she'll likely be assessed for rehoming through the military working dog adoption program." Sloane looked at him. "Which generally prioritizes former handlers and service members with documented relationships to the animal. I don't have a documented relationship. I was Garrett's teammate, not his handler." "No, but Garrett's next of kin can petition for placement, and a teammate with the endorsement of the handler's family typically receives significant weight in that assessment." She held his gaze for a moment. "Do you know Garrett's family?" "His mother," Devlin said. "She lives in Baxter Falls. We've stayed in touch." He looked at Sable across the room. "She told me once that Garrett used to call her on the satellite phone during deployments when he could and talk about the dog for 20 minutes straight, like she was his best case for the job being worth it." Sloane finished the chart entry she was on and set the pen down for a second. "Call her," she said. He looked at her. "Call Garrett's mother tonight, before the official process starts. Let her know what's happened and what the process looks like. Give her the information so she can make an informed decision rather than finding out through a federal notification letter in 3 weeks." She picked the pen back up. "People deserve to know things in the right order from the right people." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a philosophy you developed on your own? Or 12 years in emergency medicine," she said. "You learn early that how people receive information changes what they're able to do with it." He nodded slowly. Then, "Sloane." She looked up. "Whatever Marcus Tully was, he was right to trust you with this." She didn't answer that. Not because she didn't have a response, but because some things landed in a place that didn't require immediate handling, and this was one of them. But the arrest of Victor Hale was processed formally at 4:47 in the afternoon, in the presence of his attorney, in front of approximately 20 witnesses, including several former auction attendees who had declined to leave after the NCIS team arrived and were now watching from near the registration tables with the particular focused attention of people who understood they were watching something that didn't happen every day. Price read the charges with the even delivery of someone who had done this enough times to have learned that it landed harder when you didn't add theater to it. Fraud. Conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government. Illegal transfer of government property. Falsification of official military records. Conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. 4 counts of animal neglect under federal statutes applicable to military working animals. The list was long and each item was specific, and by the time Price finished, Hale's attorney had the look of someone revising her billing estimate significantly upward. Hale himself said nothing. He stood through the reading with his hands at his sides and his face carrying the specific blankness of a man who had spent years managing other people's perception of him and had arrived at a moment where perception was no longer relevant. He was processed with efficiency and without drama, which was somehow worse than if he'd tried to fight it. The absence of resistance from a man who had built an operation this size for this long suggested that whatever he was saving his energy for, it wasn't this moment. His attorney requested a private conference immediately following the formal arrest, which Price granted. They used a corner of the building that had been cleared, and whatever was said in that conference lasted 11 minutes and ended with the attorney asking to speak with Ardell directly. Sloane watched this from across the room and understood the shape of it before Ardell came to find her. "He wants to make a deal," she said before Ardell could speak. "His attorney wants to discuss cooperation," Ardell said, which was the technical version of the same thing. "He has information about the offshore account structures and the communication chain between Farr's office and the operation. He also claims to have documentation of a transaction that occurred in 2017 before the formal contract was awarded that would establish Farr's personal involvement at the inception of the network rather than as a later addition, which would close the argument that Farr was a corrupt official who was exploited by an outside contractor," Sloane said, "and establish that he was a founder. Founding liability is significantly different from participant liability at Farr's level." Ardell's voice was measured. "His attorney is framing the cooperation as time-sensitive given Farr's current location. Because if Farr reaches a non-extradition jurisdiction and establishes residence, the leverage of the 2017 documentation decreases." "Correct. And Hale knows that. He's been sitting in that chair calculating this for 2 hours. He waited until Farr was out of reach before offering the cooperation because Farr being gone makes Hale more valuable to you and gives him better deal terms." She looked at Ardell steadily. "He's still managing the situation. Even from a folding chair under arrest, he's managing it." Ardell allowed a small nod. "He's been doing this for 9 years. That doesn't go away immediately." "What about Farr?" "We have channels. Non-extradition doesn't mean permanent protection in all circumstances, particularly when the charges involve falsification of military service records and the death of a decorated service member." He paused. "It means it takes longer and requires diplomatic mechanisms that are outside my operational authority. But the DOJ has resources for this that I don't, and the IG's report will create pressure at a level that makes inaction politically untenable." He paused again. "I'm telling you this because you've earned the information and because I think you're going to ask about it every week until someone tells you." "Every week," she confirmed. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible. The expression of a man who had spent a long career in a world with very few clean endings and had found a way to function in that reality without becoming cynical about it. Or without becoming entirely cynical, which was the more accurate version. "We'll find him," Ardell said. "It won't be in the next 48 hours. It may not be in the next 6 months, but we'll find him." She held that. It wasn't the resolution she'd wanted. It was the one that was actually available. The formal processing of the animals took the rest of the afternoon and ran into the early evening. Each dog was assessed, photographed, scanned, and logged into a federal holding registry that Farr had helped set up using the USDA protocols she'd referenced hours earlier when she'd first called her contact at the regional office. The animals from the sublevel received immediate veterinary attention where needed. The Dutch Shepherd with the respiratory infection was transported to a veterinary hospital in Kestrel Point that the animal welfare officer had arranged in advance, which meant someone had anticipated this possibility before the day began. Sloane found that detail quietly remarkable. The preparation. The people who had looked at the shape of this operation and made arrangements for what would be needed on the other end. The infrastructure of accountability that existed around investigations like this, imperfect and slow and costly, but present. By the time the last animal was logged, the light through the building's high windows had gone orange and was heading toward gray. Most of the initial crowd had been long since released or transferred. The forensic team was completing its final documentation pass. Hale had been transported. The young handler who'd attempted the cell transmission was in federal custody with a lawyer who had arrived looking resigned, as if this particular client's situation had been a foreseeable destination for some time. Braddock was still in the building, in the administrative office, in a process that Price had described as cooperative debrief, and that was going to continue in a more formal setting tomorrow. His status was complicated: cooperating witness with documented complicity, a combination that meant his legal outcome was going to be determined by a process that involved more people and more time than today. Devlin was sitting against the east wall with Sable in the temporary kennel beside him, his phone to his ear, speaking quietly. Sloane could see from across the room that the call was one he'd been preparing himself for. She didn't watch it. She was sitting near the main entrance with Torch beside her when Price came and sat down on an equipment crate nearby. The agent had her jacket off and her sleeves rolled up and was drinking water from a bottle with the focused appreciation of someone who'd forgotten to eat and was managing the consequences. "We found the 7th evidence submission," Price said. "All 7 are intact. The archive held." Sloane let out a breath she hadn't quite realized she'd been holding. The full submission establishes the procurement fraud, the falsified death records, the animal transfers, the offshore account structure, and the chain of authorization up to FAR. It's comprehensive. Marcus Tully was thorough. "He was precise," Sloane said. "He made exactly 1 joke per shift, and it was always terrible on purpose." Price looked at her. "The submission includes a personal statement, filed with the evidence. It's 2 paragraphs. She paused. "I can't share it with you yet. It's part of an active evidence set. But when this clears the formal investigation phase and moves to prosecution, the statement will become accessible as part of the case record." She looked at her water bottle. "I wanted you to know it exists." Sloane looked at Torch. He had his head on his paws, watching the diminishing activity in the building with the patient readiness of an animal that had nowhere else to be and was content with this location for the moment. "Thank you," she said. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet that came at the end of long days that had contained more than any reasonable forecast would have assigned to them. "For what it's worth," Price said, not quite looking at her, "the watch alert that Hale's network had on your name, the one that monitored your location for 18 months. She paused. "The alert was configured to track without intervention. There's no record of any action being taken against you during that period." "Meaning they watched me but didn't move on me." "Meaning they assessed you as a low-level risk, a separated service member with no official connection to any active investigation, not worth the attention of direct action." Price's voice was even. "They underestimated what you were going to do when the information finally reached you." Sloane was quiet for a moment. "Everyone did," she said. "Yes," Price agreed. "That worked out well for us." Sloane stood up. Torch stood with her. She put her hand on the top of his head. Not the practiced assessment touch of a medical professional, just a hand on a dog who had carried something impossible for 6 years and had done it without complaint because that was what he'd been asked to do. The building around her was winding down. The last forensic equipment was being packed. The animal welfare officer was finalizing transfer paperwork. Ardell was on a call near the main entrance, pacing in the contained way of someone managing a conversation that required patience he was having to work for. Everything that had been hidden in this building was now documented, photographed, and in federal hands. The operation was dismantled. The animals were safe. The man who had built it was in custody. The man who had enabled it at the highest level was in the air above an ocean, but he was in the air with the full machinery of a federal investigation behind him. And that machinery was slow, but it was also, when properly motivated, relentless. It was not clean. It was not finished. There were threads still loose and questions still unanswered, and a flight path that pointed toward a jurisdiction that was going to require months of diplomatic work that Sloane would not be present for. The world did not resolve itself into completion on a single day. But Marcus's evidence was intact. The animals were out of the kennels. Braddock was talking. Hale was in federal custody. And the man who had mocked a nurse in hospital scrubs for showing up, uninvited to a private auction, was sitting in a federal transport vehicle processing the realization that the specific person he'd dismissed in the first 5 minutes of the day had, by the end of it, been the organizing axis around which the entire operation's exposure had turned. Sloane walked toward the exit with Torch at her left leg. She stopped at the door. Because Price was on her feet suddenly, phone pressed to her ear, and the expression on her face was the one Sloane had catalogued over the course of the day as the Price version of urgency: contained, directed, the look of someone receiving information that required immediate action on a timeline that had just contracted. She turned to Ardell. said something short. Ardell's face did the same thing. Sloane waited. Price crossed the room to her. "The flight far boarded," she said. "It landed 2 hours ago." Sloane waited. "Not at the filed destination. It diverted. Mechanical issue, declared en route." Price's voice was level but fast. "It landed at an airfield in a jurisdiction with a current extradition treaty with the United States. The airfield notified the flight authority on landing. The flight authority, as part of standard protocol for diverted charter flights, ran the passenger manifest." Sloane understood before Price said it. "He's detained," Price said. "The airfield is holding him pending our formal request. We have approximately 6 hours before his legal representation will have worked through the local system enough to complicate the detention." 6 hours. From a federal facility in the capital region to a viable extradition request to a foreign airfield authority. "Is that enough time?" Sloane asked. Price looked at her with the expression of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that enough time was always a question of how many people were working and how fast. "We'll find out," she said, and turned back toward Ardell, already moving. Sloane stood in the doorway of the Kestrel Point facility with the evening light coming in orange across the concrete floor, and torch pressed against her leg, and she held the specific fragile weight of a situation that had not finished resolving itself but had arrived at the last turning point before it did. And then her phone rang. The number on the screen was Dunmore Regional Medical Center's main line. The nursing supervisor on overnight, a shift that was starting in 11 hours that Sloane had not called out from, had not arranged coverage for, had not thought about since 6 in the morning when she'd left the hospital bathroom in clean scrubs with a cracked windshield and a gas station coffee and an envelope that had been waiting for her on her kitchen table for 3 days. She looked at the phone. She looked at Torch. She looked at the building behind her, where Price and Ardell were now both on separate calls, and the forensic team was completing its final documentation, and the last of the evidence that Marcus Tully had spent the last months of his life building was being carefully, properly logged into a system that would take it the rest of the way. She answered the phone. "This is Merritt," she said, and the nursing supervisor said, "Sloane, we've got a situation. Not here. Not anything connected to this building or this day. Something at Dunmore Regional. Something clinical. The specific voice of a hospital that had a need and knew where to reach the person who could meet it." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "Tell me what you've got," and started walking toward her car because she was a trauma nurse from a small city, and the world didn't stop requiring that from her just because this particular day had also required everything else. Torch walked beside her into the evening light, and somewhere above them, in the processed air of a detained charter flight on a runway, on the other side of the world, a man in a dark suit was discovering for the first time in a 9-year career of careful construction that the one variable he hadn't fully accounted for was the specific quality of people who carry things without making noise about it, and the distances those people were willing to travel when something that mattered finally gave them a reason to move. The situation at Dunmore Regional was a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate bypass. 6 patients incoming, 2 critical, the overnight trauma team short-staffed because of a scheduling gap that nobody had caught until the ambulances were already en route. Standard catastrophe. The kind that happened on Saturday evenings with the reliability of a weather pattern. Sloane drove 4 hours back the way she'd come, with Torch in the back seat and the windows cracked and the radio off, and she ran through the incoming patient profiles in her head the way she always did. Mechanism of injury, likely presentations, resource allocation, which attending would be on, what the triage sequence should look like if the paramedic reports held when the patients actually arrived. She was back in Dunmore by 10:15. She left Torch in her car with the windows down in the staff parking structure, which was enclosed and temperature-controlled and where she could check on him between patients, and she walked into the emergency department in the same scrub she'd been wearing for 20 hours and told the charge nurse she was here. "You look terrible," said the charge nurse, whose name was Rosamond and who had worked alongside Sloane for 7 years and was constitutionally incapable of social lubrication. "I know," Sloane said. "What do we have?" They worked until 3 in the morning. Both critical patients stabilized. One required a surgical consult that Sloane pushed for 40 minutes before the attending agreed, which was a conversation she'd had enough times to have it on autopilot, while 90% of her attention stayed on the patient. The other critical case was a 17-year-old who was scared in the specific way of someone who had never been seriously hurt before and didn't have a framework for it yet. And Sloane stayed with her longer than the clinical requirements strictly demanded, because sometimes what a patient needed wasn't another procedure. It was a person who would stay in the room without needing anything from them in return. She didn't tell anyone at the hospital what had happened in Kestrel Point. There wasn't a version of that conversation that fit inside a trauma bay at midnight. She filed it in the same place she filed other things that didn't have an appropriate context yet, and went back to the work. At 3:15, she went to the parking structure, sat in the back seat with the door open and Torch's head in her lap, and slept for 2 hours without meaning to. The world found out about Kestrel Point on a Tuesday. The DOJ issued a press statement that was technically restrained and managed to convey the scope of the charges anyway, because the scope was large enough that restraint only contained it so much. Fraud, conspiracy, falsification of military service records, the illegal transfer of 38 military working animals over a period of 9 years through a procurement network that reached from a converted livestock facility in Kestrel Point to a Pentagon acquisition office. Victor Hale, named. Leonard Braddock, named as a cooperating witness. Colonel Reginald Farr, named as a co-conspirator, currently in federal custody pending extradition proceedings. The extradition had been completed in 4 days. Not 6 hours, the legal process had taken longer than Price's optimistic window, but 4 days, which by diplomatic standards was fast enough that someone senior had made calls that accelerated the mechanics of it considerably. Ardell, when Sloane asked him about it in one of the 3 phone calls they had in the 2 weeks following Kestrel Point, said only that the DoD IG's office had resources for situations like this, and that the political environment around falsified military death records had created a level of institutional motivation that was, for once, actually useful. Farr was returned to the United States on a Thursday morning. There were photographs, not staged for the press, just the unavoidable documentation of a federal transfer at an airport, a man in a suit that had traveled badly flanked by federal marshals, looking at the ground in the way people looked at the ground when they understood that the ground was now the most reliable thing in their immediate environment. The photographs circulated. They were not flattering, and they were not meant to be. Sloane saw them on her phone during a break between patients, and looked at them for approximately 30 seconds, and then put her phone away and went back to work. She had spent a long time imagining what it would feel like to see accountability arrive for the machinery that had taken Marcus. She had expected something large, some significant internal event corresponding to the external one. What she felt instead was quieter and more complicated than that. Not disappointment exactly. More like the recognition that resolution and closure were different things, and that one could arrive without the other, and that this was not a failure of the situation, but simply an accurate description of how the world worked for people who had lost something irreplaceable. Farr's arrest was justice. It was real, and it mattered, and she did not discount it. It did not give her Marcus back. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she was old enough and tired enough to hold them without requiring them to reconcile. The formal hearing of Sloane's medical separation case was scheduled for 6 weeks after Kestrel Point, and it was the kind of bureaucratic process that moved at its own pace, regardless of how many federal investigations were occurring around it. She drove to the Naval Administrative Office in Harwell City on a Wednesday morning in a car she'd finally gotten the windshield fixed on, wearing clothes that weren't scrubs, which felt slightly strange. Ardell had submitted a declaration to the reviewing board. Price had submitted a second one. The NCIS case file, as much of it as was unclassified at that stage, had been made available to the board as supporting documentation. The classified portions had been reviewed in camera by the board's designated officer and summarized in language that made the essential facts available without compromising the ongoing prosecution. The finding took 40 minutes of deliberation. Sloane's medical separation had been improperly generated. The incident cited as the basis for separation had been reviewed and found to be either fabricated or materially misrepresented in the official record. Her service record was corrected. Her separation status was reclassified. Benefits and back pay associated with a proper medical separation, rather than a disciplinary one, would be calculated and processed. The board chair, a commander in her late 50s who had the bearing of someone who had sat on enough of these boards to understand that the paperwork in front of her represented a real person's real life, read the finding without editorial. Then she looked up and said, "For the record, Your conduct at the Kestrel Point facility contributed directly to the recovery of evidence that has been central to a federal prosecution of significant scope. The board notes that with respect. Sloane said, "Thank you." She drove home afterward and sat in her kitchen for a while. Torch was on the floor near the table, having been living in her apartment on a temporary basis that had developed the comfortable shape of something less temporary by the day. He'd adapted to the apartment with the pragmatic ease of a dog that understood shelter was shelter and company was company, and had identified the specific patch of afternoon light near the south window as his preferred resting location with the efficiency of an animal that had learned not to waste time on indecision about good things. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she had the thought that Marcus would have found the situation both entirely predictable and quietly gratifying, and that the imagined version of his reaction, that one bad joke, that precise, careful half-smile, was something she was going to carry for a long time and had stopped trying to put down. Some things you carried. That wasn't weakness. It was just the true cost of having had something worth carrying. The Veterans Legacy Working Dog Fund, Hale's nonprofit, was formally dissolved by court order in the 8th week after Kestrel Point. Its assets, such as they were, after the legal fees and seizures, were directed by the court to a legitimate military K-9 welfare organization that had been operating without fanfare for 12 years and had the specific, unglamorous competence of organizations that did real work without resources to spare on visibility. The 38 animals from Kestrel Point were processed through the federal system over a period of 10 weeks. 11 were rehomed with former handlers or verified service-connected individuals. 7 went into an accredited service dog training program that certified them for work with veterans managing PTSD, which struck Sloane as the correct use of animals that had already demonstrated that they could operate in high-stress environments, redirected rather than retired, which suited their temperaments better. The remaining animals, older or with medical needs that made working placement unsuitable, were placed with approved adopters who had gone through a vetting process administered by the animal welfare officer from Kestrel Point, who had apparently decided this specific population of animals was going to be her responsibility and had organized accordingly. Sable went to Devlin Reyes. It wasn't a smooth process. It was 6 weeks of paperwork and documentation and 2 separate interviews with a placement coordinator and 1 with the animal welfare officer. And at one point a form was rejected for a clerical error and had to be resubmitted, which Devlin described to Sloane on the phone in the flat voice of a man who had successfully conducted night operations in 3 different countries and was being defeated by a PDF. But it resolved. Garrett Hollis's mother had submitted a formal letter of support that the placement coordinator had described as one of the most clearly written documents she'd received in her professional career, and Devlin had read it twice and then called Sloane at 7 in the morning without calculating the time difference. She said Garrett always knew Sable would end up somewhere good, he said. She said she was glad it was someone who'd been there. Sloane was on her second cup of coffee and had a shift in 4 hours. How'd the first night go? She slept on my bed without asking. And? A pause. And I let her. Another pause, shorter. She still tracks with her head tilted to the right, compensating for the eye. I didn't realize how quickly I'd learned to read it. Working dogs tell you what they need, Sloane said. You just have to watch instead of talk. Is that something they taught you, or something you figured out? Both, she said. The figuring out takes longer, but it sticks better. Victor Hale entered a guilty plea on 63 counts in month 4 of the prosecution, having apparently decided that cooperation was a more favorable strategy than trial. Once the full scope of Braddock's testimony and the server archive became clear to his legal team, his attorney negotiated a sentencing agreement that was formal and specific. 14 years, federal facility, restitution to the DoD for the assessed value of the improperly transferred government property, and a permanent bar from any federal contracting activity. It was not the maximum the charges could have carried. It was not a light outcome. The sentencing hearing was a public record. Sloane read the court summary during a lunch break at Dunmore Regional, sitting in the staff lounge with a sandwich she was eating without tasting. She read it through once, set her phone face down on the table, and finished her sandwich. Rosamond came in, poured herself coffee, looked at Sloane with the particular attention she occasionally deployed when she thought something was happening that required acknowledgement. "You good?" "Yeah," Sloane said. "You sure?" Working on it? Rosamond poured a second cup and set it in front of Sloane, which was her version of an extended emotional support conversation, and then sat down across from her and didn't say anything else, which was also correct. Sloane drank the coffee. Someone I knew a long time ago was right about something important, she said eventually, and it cost him everything to be right about it, and the people who made that cost happen are going to prison. She looked at her cup. And that's the right outcome. And it doesn't fix what happened to him, and I knew that going in. She paused. I just didn't know how much I'd still feel both of those things at the same time afterward. Rosamond considered this with the care of someone who understood that the question wasn't looking for an answer. That's because you're a person, she said, not a result. Sloane looked at her. Cases close, Rosamond said. People don't. She finished her coffee and stood up. You've got 12 minutes. The Reyes kid in Bay 4 has been asking for the nurse who explained his discharge instructions in a way that made sense. Sloane stood up. 12 minutes is enough. It always has been for you, Rosamond said, and left. Colonel Reginald Farr's trial began in month 7. It ran for 19 days. The prosecution's case was built on the server archive, the offshore account documentation Pelham had carried, Braddock's testimony, Hale's cooperation, and the 7 evidence submissions that Marcus Tully had filed through the sealed NCIS channel in the weeks before the Farhan Valley mission. The jury deliberated for 3 days, guilty on all counts. The judge, in her sentencing statement, used language that was judicial and measured and still managed to convey that she understood what she was looking at. A senior military official who had exploited his institutional access to erase the identities of military working animals and the records of the service members who had worked alongside them for financial gain over a period of 9 years, and who had arranged the operational conditions of a mission in a way that resulted in the death of a decorated service member who had been close to exposing him. The last charge, conspiracy contributing to the death of a federal officer, carried the weight that the other charges, significant as they were, did not. It was the one that changed Farr's face when it was read. Not remorse, or at least not the kind that came from genuine reckoning with what he'd done. The kind that came from understanding, finally and without remaining ambiguity, that the thing you built to protect yourself had become the mechanism of your own destruction. He was sentenced to 22 years. No possibility of early release on the conspiracy charge. Sloane was not in the courtroom. She was at Dunmore Regional in the middle of a shift in Bay 3 with a 68-year-old man who was having a cardiac event that required her full attention and got it. She found out about the verdict from a text message from Ardell. 3 words. Guilty. All counts. That she read on her phone between the patient being stabilized and the attending arriving for handoff. She typed back, "Thank you for everything." He replied, "You did this. Don't forget that." She pocketed her phone and went back to work. Leonard Braddock received a sentence of 4 years, with credit for time served and cooperation. It was a sentence that would satisfy almost no one completely, too lenient for the people who measured his culpability by the outcomes, too significant for the people who weighed his eventual assistance. Justice at the human scale was almost never the shape anyone drew in their head when they imagined it in advance. It was always more complicated, more imperfect, more dependent on the specific texture of specific circumstances than the clean version allowed for. Sloane thought about this more than she expected to, not because she had strong feelings about Braddock's specific outcome, but because the question of what people owed each other when they'd done damage in compromised circumstances, when the damage was real but the circumstances genuinely constrained the choices, was not one that had a formula. It required judgment, human judgment, applied to specific cases by specific people, with all the imprecision that entailed. She had been a trauma nurse long enough to know that the body didn't care about the circumstances of its injuries. The wound was the wound. But she had also been a trauma nurse long enough to know that how people got to the emergency room, the decisions they'd made, the situations they'd been in, the things they'd been trying to protect or escape, mattered to what happened to them next. Context didn't excuse the damage. It shaped what healing looked like. She was not sure she had forgiven Braddock. She was also not sure that was the right category for what she felt about him. What she knew was that the evidence that put Farr in prison for 22 years had passed through Braddock's hands for 6 years without being destroyed, and that the specific, limited thing he'd managed to do right in a situation where he'd done much wrong had been necessary. And she could hold that without resolving it into something cleaner, because clean wasn't the available option, and she had stopped waiting for it. The Marcus Tully Memorial Canine Recovery Initiative was Devlin's idea, and he brought it to Sloane 3 months after Kestrel Point on a phone call that started as an update on Sable's veterinary checkup and turned into a 40-minute conversation about what should happen to the facility once the federal proceedings cleared it for repurposing. Sloane's first response was that she was a trauma nurse, not a nonprofit director. Devlin's response was that he was a former SEAL, not a program administrator, and that neither of those facts had stopped either of them from doing things that required different skills when the situation called for it. She thought about this for a week. Then she called Ardell and asked if there were any legal impediments to a nonprofit using the Kestrel Point facility under a court-supervised repurposing arrangement. Ardell told her that was above his operational authority, but that he could put her in contact with the DOJ attorney handling the asset disposition, which he did. The process took 5 months. Paperwork, vetting, a board structure, a partnership with the animal welfare officer from Kestrel Point, whose name was Petra Osei, and who turned out to have a background in veterinary social work that made her exactly the right person for the program's clinical framework, and a formal agreement with Dunmore Regional that allowed Sloane to maintain her nursing position while taking on a part-time medical advisory role for the initiative. Dr. Nadia Four came on as the veterinary director without being asked twice. The Marcus Tully Memorial Canine Recovery Initiative opened in the spring, 8 months after the auction that had never been completed. The facility had been cleaned, repaired, and converted with the unglamorous practicality of people working with a budget that required them to make careful decisions about what mattered most. The kennels were proper, the medical space was functional, the exercise areas were adequate. None of it was beautiful in a design sense. It was useful, which was the right goal. The opening was not a ceremony with speeches. It was a Saturday in April when the first 8 animals arrived, and Sloane, Devlin, Four, and Petra spent 6 hours getting them settled, assessed, and oriented to a space that was designed to be safe rather than impressive. Torch moved through the facility like someone doing a security check. Systematic, attentive, unhurried. And when he completed his circuit, he came back to Sloane's left side and sat down with the air of an animal that had determined the situation was acceptable. Devlin watched this and said, "Does he do that everywhere?" "Every new space," Sloane said. "He walks the perimeter first. Marcus trained him to do a safety check before settling." She looked at Torch. "Old habits." "Good habits," Devlin said. They stood in the main room of the facility, which smelled like fresh paint and clean concrete and the particular living warmth of animals properly housed. And Sloane looked at the space around her and thought about the distance between this moment and the one 8 months earlier when she'd walked through a side door in hospital scrubs with an envelope and no plan except to find the thing she'd come to find. She hadn't known what she was walking into. She hadn't known the scope of it, hadn't known about Pelham or Braddock or the 7 sealed submissions or the encrypted server archive or the Pentagon Acquisition Office or any of the architecture of the thing that had taken Marcus. She had known one name on a manifest and one scar on a dog, and the specific certainty of a person who had been carrying an unanswered question long enough to understand that the answer wasn't going to arrive on its own. She had driven 4 hours on no sleep because she was the kind of person who drove 4 hours on no sleep when something mattered. That was not a superhuman quality. It was not strategic genius. It was stubbornness applied in the right direction at the right time, by someone who had been underestimated so consistently and for so long that she had stopped explaining herself to the people doing the underestimating and had simply gone ahead and done the thing. The people who laughed when Victor Hale said, "This isn't a hospital charity event," had watched the same woman they'd dismissed become the axis around which every subsequent event turned. That was not poetic justice. It was just what happened when you wrote someone off based on what they were wearing instead of what they were carrying. People carried more than they showed. That was the truest thing Sloane had learned in 12 years of emergency medicine and a decade before that of something else entirely. The man bleeding in Bay 3 might be a mechanic or a veteran or someone who hadn't slept properly in 6 years because he was protecting something he couldn't talk about. The woman in hospital scrubs at a private auction might be the person who remembered the scar, spoke the name, and pulled a thread that unraveled 9 years of organized criminal erasure. Yuta did not know what people were carrying until circumstances required them to put it down or use it. And the mistake, the consistent, expensive, consequential mistake, was deciding in advance that you already knew. Torch leaned against her leg. She put her hand on his back. The scar under her palm was the same scar she'd made in a field condition 6 years ago, with inadequate lighting and the adrenaline of an operational context and a handler who'd talked to his dog the entire time in a low, steady voice because the dog's composure under treatment affected the quality of the suturing, and Marcus Tully was precise about everything. He had been precise enough to leave a truth in the one place no one thought to look, carried by the one living thing he trusted completely, waiting for the one person who would know exactly what it meant. She had been that person. She hadn't known she was being prepared for it. She hadn't known she was being trusted with it. She had just kept doing the work, kept showing up, kept knowing what she knew without requiring anyone else to validate it, until the day the envelope arrived and the reason for all of it finally became clear. That was how the quiet ones moved through the world. Not invisibly. They were always visible, always present, always doing what needed doing, just unrecognized, which was a different thing entirely. And the gap between invisible and unrecognized was where all the real work happened, in the space that other people weren't paying attention to, by the people that other people had already dismissed. The 8 animals settled. The facility warmed with the particular living quality of a space that had been converted from something that hoarded to something that held with care. Devlin was across the room with Sable, who was tracking a dust mote near the window with the alert, slightly tilted attention of a dog that had learned to compensate for her limitations without letting them define what she reached for. Petra was making notes on her clipboard with the focused efficiency of someone who was already 3 steps ahead of the current task. Fayur was in the medical bay running her initial assessments with the same methodical care she'd brought to the livestock floor 8 months ago. Sloane stood in the middle of it and felt the specific weight of a thing completed. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in the clean shape she might have chosen, but completed. The dogs were out. The truth was documented. The men who had built the architecture of erasure were in federal custody accounting for it. The record that had been falsified was corrected. The name that had been hidden was restored. And she was standing in a facility that bore the name of the man who had trusted that someone would eventually arrive to do exactly this, because he had known her well enough to believe that the specific combination of what she knew and what she refused to let go of would be sufficient when the moment came to carry it the rest of the way. She thought it probably would have embarrassed him, having his name on the building. He had been precise and careful, and he had made one deliberate bad joke per shift. He would have said something dry about the font choice. She would have told him the font was fine. He would have looked at Torch and then back at her with that half smile that cost him nothing and meant everything, and she would have understood that the font was not actually what he was talking about. She understood it now. Some things arrived late. They arrived anyway. And the people who stayed in position long enough, who kept doing the work, kept holding what they knew, kept moving toward the thing that mattered even when the road was empty and the map was wrong and no one was watching. Those people were not rare in the way that heroes in stories were rare. They were ordinary. They worked night shifts. They drove cracked windshields on empty highways. They showed up in the wrong clothes to the wrong events and asked the one question nobody had thought to script an answer for. They were everywhere, carrying everything, waiting for the moment when the circumstances finally asked them to put it down. Torch looked up at her. "I know," she said quietly. "Let's go check on the others." And they went.